The Colombian native making a fresh start in the Sunshine State.
Ella buscaba una tranquilidad y un mejor futuro para sus hijos.
She was very trusting, very loving. She believed in the goodness of everyone.
But sometimes trust comes at a price.
She was screaming, "No, no, no," and then the phone cut out.
This is when the nightmare really starts.
The search for answers uncovers a twisted web of lies.
He noticed money was just missing. Credit cards were opened in his mother's name.
And a calculated killer, the likes of which investigators have never seen before.
I've never had a case like this where somebody did something that brazen.
We don't have the head. What do you want me to do about it?
He just laughed and said they're never going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
He was just taunting us and trying to play a game with us.
Simple.
She didn't know that she was making a deal with the devil.
February 20th, 2021, Boynton Beach, Florida. It's the depths of winter for most of the country. But here in South Florida, the sun is shining brightly.
Boynton Beach is about 50 miles from Miami. A lot of working class families and all around a great town to live in.
It's kind of old Florida, if you will. Crime does not happen in this type of neighborhood.
But that morning, one local family is starting to panic.
They hadn't heard from their loved one, 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet, in 2 days. That Tuesday was the last time I spoke with her. My cousin in Colombia calls me and says, "Prima, have you heard anything from Mary today?" I said, "No, I haven't heard from her in a couple of days." And he tells me, "Can you call her? Because we're calling her phone, but the call is not going through." So I called her phone, and her phone was going to voicemail.
"Mary, please give me a call back when you get this."
And I said, "Something is not adding up here."
So Sandra decides to contact the authorities.
"I need to file a missing persons report."
I called the police, and I remember, like if it was today, it was Saturday morning. They tell me that in order for us to report her missing, we had to wait.
"What do you mean 72 hours?
I said, "How can we wait 72 hours without knowing what's happened? We have no signs of her. We are calling her and her phone goes straight to voicemail." So it was very stressful to us.
The family has to wait another grueling 24 hours before they can officially report Mary missing.
By then, Sunday morning, they opened an investigation. They had asked about Mary, what she was wearing that day. I said, "I don't know because I wasn't with her." "What does she normally carry with her?" I said, "She carries a purse."
The large black tote bag?
She always in her purse had her lipstick and her rosary. That's one thing that Mary would not ever be without.
The last time somebody had spoken to her was on February 18th of 2021. Nobody had heard from her. They were really concerned because it just wasn't like her.
Listen, we're gonna do everything that we can to find your cousin, okay?
It's so hard, I can't. We were still holding on to hope that she was gonna be found alive.
44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet had immigrated to America from Colombia after escaping an abusive relationship.
She was very friendly, very religious. You had a problem, she will come and say, "Okay, how can I help you? What do you need?"
Tomó la decisión de venirse para acá con su hija y con su hijo. Eso era lo que ella buscaba aquí, una tranquilidad y un mejor futuro para sus hijos.
She wanted to be that supportive mother. She wanted them to go to college here.
However, getting settled in their new home of Boynton Beach, Florida, wouldn't be easy.
In Colombia, Mary built a successful career as a biomedical scientist.
But unfortunately, her education credentials didn't cross over into the United States.
Sin documentos no podía ubicarse, no un trabajo. Ella a veces se iba a limpiar casas.
But after establishing roots in the community, Mary came across a special opportunity.
She was looking for a better job. Someone in the church has said to her, there's a lady that needs someone to take care of her because she lives by herself. She was starting to have the signs of dementia.
She lived down in Hialeah, which is in Miami, Florida. So Hialeah from Boynton Beach is probably a 2-hour drive.
Ella se fue a cuidar a esta señora allá a Hialeah. La señora la quería.
Hey, thank you, my dear.
Se quedó cuidando a doña ella 24/7. Ella vivía allí con ella.
At this point, Mary's kids were grown and off doing their own thing.
And it was at her new job where Mary met the man who would eventually become her husband.
Mary, this is my son, Roberto.
Very pleased to meet you, Mary.
Likewise. Mary's patient had a 66-year-old son named Roberto Colon. And almost instantly, they found a connection amongst each other.
I can't tell you how much it means that you're taking good care of my mother, to her and to me.
I'm happy to help. She's such a special woman.
Roberto lived in Boynton Beach, where Mary originally settled after moving to the U.S.
He'd come down to Hialeah now and then to visit his mother.
But after meeting Mary, he had another reason to visit.
Mary and Roberto developed a relationship, and it was on the fast track.
Lo conoció en diciembre y ya en febrero se casó con él.
But just 1 month after saying I do, Mary has mysteriously disappeared, and no one in her family has been able to get in touch with her.
This is when the nightmare really starts.
It was just radio silent, and that was completely abnormal for Mary and her communication style with her family.
Listen, we're gonna do everything that we can to find your cousin, okay?
The Boynton Beach Police Department, they take their report. It immediately gets sent over to a missing persons detective, who then starts to investigate.
Investigators begin by going to the home of Mary's husband, Roberto Colon.
If Mary is missing, why wasn't her new husband the one who made the missing report? For the police and investigators, this immediately sticks out.
But when police ask Roberto about his wife's disappearance, he doesn't seem to share the family's concern.
I don't know where I'm at with this thing.
Roberto tells police that the last time he saw his wife was 2 days ago, February 18th.
But he doesn't think she's missing. He thinks she's on the run.
And that's because the last interaction they had was a heated confrontation in which Roberto confronted Mary for stealing his mother's money.
She took my bank, my check card.
After escaping an abusive relationship in her home country, 44-year-old Colombian native Mary Gomez Millet was making a fresh start for herself in southern Florida.
Mary pivoted to being a home health care aide where she began taking care of an elderly woman.
And when she met her client's son, Roberto Colon, her life changed forever.
They got married just a couple of months after meeting each other.
But now Mary is missing. And as Boynton police pay a visit to her husband, Roberto, he claims his wife may have good reason to hide.
She took my bank, my check card.
He said he had access to his mother's bank accounts, and he noticed money was just missing from the accounts. Credit cards were opened, a new car was leased in his mother's name, and he felt like Mary was behind all this and was stealing from his mother.
I don't know what to do here. I don't want to ingress my mother. She worked all her life for that apartment.
Roberto says when he discovered what was going on, he told Mary to bring the new car to his house immediately.
He asked for the vehicle to be delivered back to his residence all the way up in Boynton Beach.
I don't know what to do, man. I've never been presented with this kind of crap.
How could you do this, Mary?
He said that when she arrived at his house, they got into an argument, but he said it wasn't really heated, it wasn't physical.
When I confronted her with this, I said, no, I didn't do anything. But then I had an appointment the same day that she came here to the urologist.
We'll talk about this when I get back from my appointment.
He said the argument ended because he had to go to a doctor's appointment, and he told Mary that when he got back from his doctor's appointment, that he was going to take her back to Hialeah and turn her in to the Hialeah Police Department.
He did my mother's house. Yeah, they will have to handle everything.
When he left, Mary was still at his house.
He said when he returned from his appointment, the car was still there, but she was gone.
I was just the biggest fool this year.
He assumed that she was scared, that she was going to get arrested, and had a friend come pick her up or something, and now was just hiding out.
Police ask Roberto if he has any idea where Mary could be hiding out. And that's when he admits he doesn't actually know his new wife all that well.
They had only met in December of 2020, and they kind of developed a friendly relationship at first, but then kind of came up with an arrangement of how this would progress.
I needed her to help me with my mother and help me with my house because I'm in the middle of trying to fix crap up, and I can't do everything at one time, and I figured it'd be a good relationship.
Basically, they came up with an agreement that Mary would take care of Roberto's mother. In exchange, Roberto would marry Mary so that she could get U.S. citizenship.
It was an agreement brokered by Roberto's mother.
Mary had said to her that, we're gonna have to start helping you look for someone else because my cousin wants me to go to Orlando to fix my papers. The lady said, no, you're not leaving me. You can stay here with me. I'm gonna talk to my son. You can marry my son and he can give you the residency. Please don't leave me.
He was very open about their relationship, that they were legally married, but it was more of a deal that they had made, each of them to benefit from it.
And it got me to tell you the truth.
After wrapping up their conversation with Roberto, police continue their investigation back at headquarters.
Can they trust Roberto's account of his relationship with Mary?
We were able to pull stuff from Mary's phone records. The main thing that we found was that the day that she was last known to be at Roberto's house, from that point forward, there was no location data, no messages, no phone calls. The phone was off.
And as detectives continue searching for clues, they make an alarming discovery in a police report filed 5 days earlier.
They see that on February 18th, just a few hours after Mary was last seen, Boynton Beach police received a call about an abandoned purse.
So, he's over here. He's just in the road, in the ditch, right?
This purse was located less than a mile from Roberto Colon's house.
And that's not all.
It reportedly had blood on it.
Said blood? That shit looks so blood.
There's blood on it?
The officer that collected the purse, he brought it back to the police department and immediately brought it into the crime scene lab.
When he turned the purse over to me, there was a substantial amount of blood on the purse. His gloves were actually covered in blood after he handled it.
There was no identification within the purse, but there was some items contained within the purse that were documented and photographed.
There was several pieces of paper in the rosary.
For the detectives investigating Mary's missing persons case, this is no coincidence.
So law enforcement, spidey senses kind of pick up and realize maybe this is Mary's purse.
We had gotten a picture from the family that showed Mary wearing a rosary, and the rosary that she was wearing in the picture was very similar to the rosary we found in the purse.
Just then, detectives learn there's a woman who is eager to speak with them. Mary's close friend, Margarita Arango.
Yeah, patch her through.
She says she has some vital information to share with detectives regarding Mary's disappearance.
Bueno, ¿tú me puedes decir qué fue la última vez que tú hablaste con ella?
Yo hablé el jueves de la semana pasada, a las 2 de la tarde fue la última llamada, el último contacto que tuvimos ella y yo.
¿A las 2 de la tarde?
Sí, señor, a las 2.
Ok.
Ella al mediodía iba para Olton Beach. Se dijo que iba para allá a llevarle el carro al señor Roberto.
Ella me dijo, Maggi, ya estoy acá en la casa de Roberto. Voy a entregarle el carro. Ya no quiero seguir más con esta situación. Ya estoy aburrida. Ya yo no quiero nada con él.
Entonces le dije, mami, alguna cosa me avisa. Le dije así, dijo, listo. Yo le dije a ella, listo. Entonces cuando yo le dije así, el teléfono de ella y el teléfono mío quedaron abiertos.
The last thing she heard from Mary was she heard Mary scream.
Ella me dijo, Maggi, Roberto, Roberto. Y yo sentí un golpe. Y ahí se fue la comunicación.
Boynton Beach police have increased search efforts in the case of missing 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millette after the discovery of a bloody purse less than 5 blocks from her husband's home.
The lab was able to accept the swabs from the purse, and the lab determined that it was consistent with human blood.
But there wasn't enough of a sample for them to be able to come back with a definitive DNA analysis one way or the other.
Now, Mary's friend Margarita Arango is providing even more reason for police to suspect foul play.
She said she was on the phone with Mary when she was at Roberto's house.
Margarita told law enforcement that she heard Mary screaming, "No, no, no, Roberto." And then the phone cut out. And that was the last she heard from Mary.
Yo sentí como que el tipo la agredió a ella, como si le hubiera quedado el celular. Algo tuvo que haberle hecho el tipo a ella porque después de ese momento ya yo no volví a tener más comunicación con ella.
From the phone records, we know that from that point forward, that phone was off.
And when Margarita heard that Mary had gone missing, she knew she needed to inform police about what she'd witnessed.
Lo único que yo quería era encontrar a Mari. Yo quería encontrarle y darle un abrazo y saber que ella estaba bien.
Police decide it's time to bring Roberto Colon in for a formal interview.
Go ahead and just give me your legal name. Roberto Colon.
Detectives confront Roberto with the information and evidence that they've found. They tell him about the conversation they had with Margarita, and they also confront him about the bloody purse.
Her purse? Yeah. We have her purse. It has blood on it. You know it's her purse? 100% it's her purse. Okay. So we need your help in making sense of that because I can't make sense of it.
Roberto says he knows nothing about it. And to prove that he's innocent, he agrees to submit to a DNA sample.
He consented to giving us his DNA. He took his shirt off so we could take pictures of his body to make sure there was no injuries. I mean, he was just so compliant.
Detectives have a lot of information, but not enough to arrest him.
They still don't have a body.
So detectives ask Roberto for permission to search his home.
You're okay if we go back now. We might need you to stay outside for a little bit while we do this search. We can spray this chemical that will show us if there's any blood or anything. Yeah.
Police ask, hey, can we walk inside and just take a look and make sure Mary's not here?
You're okay with that? Yeah.
He gave us consent, so he was allowed to be there, and We just had to do what we needed to do.
After arriving at the home, it's not long before investigators notice a chilling piece of evidence.
One of the crime scene techs noticed a little speckle of blood on the front door of the house.
Inside the home, there's additional cause for alarm.
The house inside did not have floors, it was bare concrete. Did not have drywall in many places, it was just kind of like a sheetrock wall, unfinished.
They asked him about that, and he said that he's been renovating his home, and so he ripped up some of the floorboards and has yet to replace them.
But out in the garage, crime scene techs uncover the most alarming evidence of all.
Roberto drove a Chevrolet Suburban, and the back seat of that vehicle was inside that garage next to the dog crate. I noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the bottom of that seat. There was a large green toolbox on the floor of the garage. There was a possible blood spatter on that, and the wall above that seat and toolbox.
We knew that with the blood and the spatter, someone was more than likely killed in that garage.
The disappearance of 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet has led Boynton Beach detectives back to the home of her husband, Roberto Colon, where they've just discovered what appears to be blood spatter.
So we did the stringing, and we did all the calculations for the blood spatter analysis.
While we were doing that, Roberto was standing at the door and kind of asking what Tina was doing. So I decided just to tell him, like, hey, listen, we found some spots there that look like blood spatter, and she's collecting samples of those. He said, listen, you guys can test that blood all you want. That's gonna be animal blood from my dog.
He mentioned that that was from his dog's tail that was cut or something, and I knew from my experience that didn't come from a dog. We knew that with the blood and the spatter that someone was more than likely killed in that garage.
When the blood test results come back, they confirm everyone's worst fears.
It was the next day that we got the results and were able to say that that blood was human blood that we collected in the workshop and on the front door.
But without a body, police are unable to prove it is actually Mary Gomez Millet's blood.
They didn't have any DNA from Mary, so they can't confirm if the blood actually came from her.
Regardless, investigators decide it's time to bring in the cadaver dogs.
What they ultimately ended up doing is bringing a cadaver dog to go around the inside and then the outside, the perimeter of the home. But the dog never indicated that they found anything of decomp in that backyard or contained within the home.
Even though the cadaver dog came up short, investigators aren't ready to walk away just yet.
Hello, Detective Valari.
A short time after us beginning our search, I receive a call from the neighbor almost at the same time, and he tells me, hey, listen, this guy's over here and he's saying some crazy stuff.
He's in the other room.
He says Roberto is saying things like they are not going to find her.
The neighbor also tells police that Roberto keeps asking him to look outside and see if there's a hearse parked in front of his home.
You guys need to be careful.
The neighbor was concerned for our safety because Roberto made some statements that I should just get an axe and charge at them and force them to kill me, or I believe he said I should get an AK-47 and just mow them down.
All right, yeah, we'll come right over. Don't worry, we won't let him know you called us.
Okay. So we end up going to the neighbor's house to make contact with Roberto.
Hey, buddy.
These type of psychological and emotional moments are important with investigations like this. It's clear Roberto is in a very agitated state, and detectives want to see if his heightened emotions will cause him to slip up and say something that will help in their investigation.
How typical. You're more concerned about her than what she did to me and my mother for months.
He becomes very distressed, going on about the detectives wasting his time.
He starts making statements, very vulgar statements about Mary, calling her names. It's actually at that point, too, that he refers to his workshop as an abattoir, which is a slaughterhouse, specifically usually for animals.
Whoa. What's that supposed to mean?
Roberto, at this point, seems to be alluding to police that he killed Mary. But when they continue to directly ask him if he had anything to do with it, he tells the police, "Do your job. Find the body."
It seemed like he was just taunting us and trying to play a game with us, So we end up going, "Hey, listen, you're not going to be able to go home right now. We're holding your house."
We're gonna get you a hotel. You can come back when we're done.
Initially, he did not want to go to the hotel. He wanted to stay at the neighbor's house. And the neighbor, being the nice guy that he was, he said, "Listen, I will house your pets, but given the circumstances, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with you staying here." So Roberto agreed to go to the hotel.
As darkness falls over the Boynton Beach property, detectives face the frustrating reality that they're not any closer to locating Mary.
There was a specific field where we knew Roberto would go to walk his dog. So we have officers searching those big fields, wooded areas. We have officers in boats, in canal banks in the area, checking for any evidence.
But by the next morning, there's still no sign of Mary.
We were doing subpoenas and getting back Roberto's financial records, going through phone records.
That's when detectives get a visit from Roberto's former tenant, Luciana Torres.
Yeah, go ahead and sit her in.
Luciana had a bunker or trailer that was located on Roberto's property.
It was just a temporary arrangement. She didn't live there very long.
Luciana tells police that she was often in earshot when Roberto spoke to Mary.
She's overheard conversations that he's had with Mary, ending with phrases like, "I'm gonna kill this woman and bury her in my backyard."
Those are his exact words?
It wasn't until this conversation with Luciana that I said, "You know what? I think now at this point, I have enough to go on to get another search warrant to dig the yard." The only thing that's given me some apprehension about this, I felt like that first dog that did the search, that if she was there, that dog would have hit.
But the cadaver dog trainer convinces the detective to give it one more shot.
He actually told me, he said, "Listen, at the end of the day, if my dog doesn't hit, you should still dig up that ground."
So investigators return to Roberto's home and get to work.
There was a shed back in the backyard, and off to the side of this shed was an area where there was bricks laid on the ground. I remember Rob looking at that area and calling me over.
If you notice in photographs, all the patio stones have grass or weeds growing in between the cracks. As I'm probing, I'm noticing that these bricks have no grass or weeds growing in the cracks.
These bricks, they're very fresh. Like, I could just remove them very easy. It's like they're almost just recently set.
And I started moving a couple bricks going further in, and then I hit something.
You could smell the smell that we know of, unfortunately, from, working all these years of decomposition.
I remember I looked up at him, and he was staring at me, and I'm like, there she is.
Boynton Beach police have been searching for evidence that 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millet's husband, Roberto Colon, is responsible for her disappearance. Now they may have finally found it in Roberto's own backyard.
I would say it was 3 to 4 feet below ground is when we first noticed skin.
I remember I looked up at him, and he was staring at me, and I'm like, there she is.
As they're shuffling the dirt away, we start to see that this body doesn't have any legs below the kneecap or a head.
They're not able to find the head, but what they do find is a metal steel pipe that was buried next to the torso. Detectives believe that this is the murder weapon.
That pipe was solid steel, but it was bent, like it hit something hard. And, you know, we later came to find out that both of Mary's forearms were broken and the bones were completely cracked, almost kind of like a defensive posture.
The remains are transported to the medical examiner's office.
She did still have skin on her fingers, so the medical investigator was able to get fingerprints from her.
They are able to compare the fingerprints they took from the torso to the fingerprints that the Colombian consulate has. It's a positive match. This is the torso of Mary Gomez Millet.
Cuando me entró la llamada a darme la noticia de que la habían encontrado allá en la casa de este hombre, en las condiciones que la encontraron, eso para mí fue muy duro, demasiado. Me sentía muy triste.
When the detectives tells me we found Mary, but unfortunately I have to tell you that she's not alive. My whole world just stops right there. Like, how am I gonna tell the family? You know, that we're still keeping that hope over there.
Fortunately, though, police now have enough evidence to charge Roberto Colon with first-degree murder. But even in handcuffs, Roberto is still smug as ever.
Prior to him being transported to the police department, I wanted to see if he would make any last statements to the neighbor.
The neighbor came out and said, "Hey man, what's going on? Is everything okay?" And he just laughed and said, "Yeah, everything's fine. Don't worry. They're never going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again."
Humpty Dumpty, as we all know, is a character that had all his limbs fall apart. So what Roberto is saying is chilling.
Getting him to reveal the location of Mary's head is going to be no easy task.
However, detectives know they have to try. Back at the police station, they sit down with Roberto once again.
He wasn't very talkative at this point. I started the interview by showing him a picture of the body, just to see his reaction, and he was kind of not even fazed by it.
Roberto, I gotta say to you, man, you're crafty, you have outsmarted us in a lot of ways, and even now, after we have found her body, we're still asking ourselves a lot of questions, okay?
Now they're at a pivotal moment in the interrogation. They could tell Roberto doesn't want to tell them the truth, but they use their skills to try and get it out of him.
Like I told Marco the other guys, like, he's smart, man. This guy's smart. He still has us right now, scratching our head, trying to figure this out.
Detectives continue to press him about where Mary's head is and where her legs are. Roberto refuses to give any further information and says that there will never be closure for anyone.
We don't have the head. Okay.
What do you want me to do about it?
Detectives at this point believe that they're not going to get any further information from Roberto. He's just going to continue playing games. They book him on first-degree murder charges, and then they send Roberto over to Palm Beach County Jail.
In February 2022, almost 1 year after Mary Gomez Millet's murder, Roberto Colon heads to trial.
It's weird because, you know, you'd think, how could you even be nervous? You found her in his backyard, but there's never an easy trial to go into as a detective.
Right off the bat, it becomes clear to prosecutors that this calculated killer isn't going down without a fight.
He says that Mary is the one who caused all of this, and he acted out in self-defense.
after discovering the remains of 44-year-old Mary Gomez Millette in her husband's backyard, Florida officials are hoping for a swift conviction.
It's always difficult for prosecution when you don't have an eyewitness to a crime, but with all of the circumstantial evidence, everything was pointing in the same direction, and that direction was directly at Roberto Colon.
But as the trial gets underway, the defense presents an astonishing claim that Roberto was acting in self-defense.
The defense did the unique decision of calling Roberto Colon to the stand to testify in his own defense. And when Roberto testified, he talked all about how Mary thieved from him and stole from his mother.
Roberto says that he confronted Mary and she became violent.
He said that they were walking out towards the garage area and that she had her purse, she swung it at him and hit him with it, and that he basically lost control and picked up the nearest item and just hit her in the head with it.
But when it's the prosecution's turn, they methodically disassemble the defense's case.
Mary's screams that her friend Margarita heard over the phone suggest that it was Roberto who attacked first and not the other way around.
Roberto planned this homicide. He lured her to his residence. He knew what he was going to do.
Roberto?
There was absolutely no proof that Mary was stealing. She was using the mother's money, but for the mother's caretaking.
Even though he had no confirmed proof that she in fact was doing this, he decided he was going to take matters into his own hands and beat her to death.
He then dismembered her body because he didn't know what to do with it after he killed her.
Based on the disturbing statements he went on to make to his neighbor and the police, it's clear that he didn't feel any regret for what he'd done. Roberto was glad he'd murdered Mary until he got caught for it.
When I cross-examined him, I asked him how many times he hit her, and he said he just kept hitting her repeatedly, over and over and over. It was very obvious to my jury that he was reliving and sort of fantasizing about his crime.
When prosecutors question Roberto about Mary's remaining limbs, they don't get the answer they were hoping for.
Roberto testified that he buried them in the backyard, but when I tell you law enforcement ripped up that backyard, they would have found it. And so, truthfully, I don't know what he did with the legs, nor do we truthfully know what he did with her head.
When the jury retires to deliberate, everyone is holding their breath.
They deliberated for longer than I thought. That's always nerve-wracking. I thought it would be 10-minute deliberation, but it went on for, I think, a couple hours.
However, it's soon clear no one is sympathizing with Roberto.
When they returned, they had found him guilty of premeditated murder, and he was then sentenced to life in prison without parole.
This case stood out because of the brutality. I mean, I've never had a case like this where it was that violent and somebody did something that brazen.
He felt justified in what he did. He thought he could get away with it.
La peor decisión que la mamá de Roberto tomó, haberle presentado a su hijo, fue una persona muy espectacular, una buena amiga, una buena mamá, una buena hija, una buena mujer. No encuentro palabras negativas para Mari, no las encuentro.
She came here from Colombia to start a new life. And soon after she arrived, she didn't know that she was making a deal with the devil.
Oh my God, I wish I could hug her one more time. Mary was a beautiful soul, always. No matter the hard time that she was having, she will swallow all her pain and give you nothing but love.
Mary's loved ones hope her story can serve as a cautionary tale for others.
What if the clue that finally exposed a killer after nearly 6 decades had been sitting quietly in a police evidence locker the entire time? Not a hidden confession, not a secret witness, not a dramatic fingerprint discovered decades later, a cigarette butt. a tiny piece of discarded evidence left behind in a San Rafael home in 1966, when DNA testing did not exist and investigators could only wonder whether it belonged to the person who had just committed a brutal murder. For almost 60 years, the identity of that person remained officially unresolved. Then science caught up with the evidence. On February 1st, still 1966, 60-year-old Marjorie Rudolph was alone inside the home she shared with her husband in San Rafael, California, when her ordinary day turned into a crime scene. Rudolph was the wife of a prominent banker, and the violence that followed would leave investigators confronting a murder that seemed to contain more questions than answers. She was brutally beaten and found in her bath. There was no modern forensic technology available to tell investigators whose biological material might have been left behind. There was no genetic genealogy capable of reaching backward through a family tree. There was no database waiting to connect an unknown DNA profile to a suspect. There was only a crime scene, physical evidence, witnesses, theories, and a community demanding answers, and almost immediately, investigators had a name in mind: Laurel James Switzer. He was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. Police knew him. He knew the Rudolph family. Investigators believed there had been some kind of dispute between Switzer and the Rudolphs that could have provided a possible motive, but suspicion was not proof. Investigators could not conclusively connect him to the murder. And then something happened that would make the case even more haunting. Just 8 days after Marjorie Rudolph was killed, Switzer died by suicide. The man investigators had considered a possible suspect was suddenly gone. There would be no courtroom confrontation, no cross-examination, no confession under oath, no opportunity to explain where he had been or why evidence might have connected him to the house. The case remained unresolved, and somewhere inside the evidence collected at the Rudolph home were cigarette butts that investigators believed could have belonged to the person responsible. They could see them. They could collect them. They could preserve them. But in 1966, they could not ask the question that would become decisive 60 years later. Whose DNA is on this cigarette? That question belonged to the future. For decades, the cigarette butts remained silent. The murder became an old file. The witnesses aged. Investigators retired. Memories faded. The world moved from black and white television to computers, smartphones, digital surveillance, and forensic laboratories capable of reading genetic information from microscopic traces. Yet the physical evidence remained. The case did not disappear. It waited. And decades later, two retired San Rafael police investigators, Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald, decided that waiting was no longer enough. They continued working cold cases as volunteers, refusing to treat the age of the Rudolph investigation as a reason to stop asking questions. In 2025, they partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and submitted forensic evidence from the case to Othram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis. The evidence had survived nearly 60 years. Now investigators wanted to know whether modern science could finally extract something from it that the original detectives could never have imagined. The answer would change the case. Othram was able to extract DNA from the preserved cigarette evidence and use genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. That profile could then be used in a genetic genealogy investigation. Suddenly, the cigarette butts were no longer simply old objects sitting inside an evidence file. They were a biological message from 1966. The investigation could finally ask the evidence to speak, and what it said pointed back toward the man investigators had suspected from the beginning. But before that breakthrough could be understood, investigators had to return to the day Marjorie Rudolph was killed, to a quiet San Rafael home where something terrible had happened behind closed doors. Rudolph was 60 years old. She was at home alone while her husband was hospitalized. That detail would become an important part of the original investigation because it established a narrow window in which the killer could have entered the house without the husband being present. The murder scene was not a random roadside attack. It was inside a private residence. Someone had entered a place that should have been safe. Rudolph was brutally attacked, beaten, and ultimately found in her bathtub. Contemporary reporting and later accounts described the violence as severe, with her body discovered in the bathroom. Investigators immediately faced the central question that defines almost every homicide: who had a reason to enter that house, and who had the opportunity to do it? The scene did not simply tell a story of violence. It contained fragments: the location, the timing, the condition of the home, the evidence left behind. And among that evidence were cigarette butts that stood out to investigators. According to later accounts, the cigarettes were a different brand from those generally smoked by people who lived in or regularly occupied the home, making them potentially significant. At the time, however, a cigarette butt could only take investigators so far. It might indicate that someone had been inside. It might suggest that a visitor had spent time there. It might become a clue about who had entered the house, but it could not provide the definitive biological identification that modern DNA testing could eventually deliver. That limitation would become the defining frustration of the investigation. The investigators could see the evidence, but could not extract its future meaning. They were working in an era when forensic science had not yet developed the ability to identify an individual from DNA. The cigarette was evidence, but it was evidence without a name. Then investigators turned toward Switzer. He had a relationship with the Rudolph family. There had been a dispute. His name entered the investigation. The circumstances were serious enough for him to become a person of interest, but investigators still lacked the proof needed to conclusively connect him to the crime. This distinction mattered. In a cold case, suspicion can survive for decades, but suspicion is not the same as a proven fact. The original investigators could not take the final step. Then Switzer left the Bay Area. He traveled to South Lake Tahoe. 8 days after Rudolph's murder, he died by suicide. His death transformed the investigation. If he was responsible, he would never stand trial. If he was innocent, he would never have the opportunity to establish that innocence in court. The investigation had lost the person investigators wanted to question most. The case went cold. Years became decades. The Rudolph murder slowly moved from an active investigation to an old case file, yet the evidence remained preserved. Somewhere inside the police department's records was the original crime scene. Somewhere inside those records were the cigarette butts, and somewhere inside those cigarette butts was biological material that modern science could potentially analyze. The world changed around the case, but the evidence did not know that time had passed. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to ignore. In 1966, the cigarette butt was a minor physical object. In 2025, it became the center of a forensic investigation. A clue that investigators could not fully use became the clue that could finally resolve the case. The retired detectives understood that old evidence was not necessarily useless evidence. They were willing to test it again. That decision set in motion a process that would eventually reach across 6 decades. The preserved evidence was sent for advanced testing. Scientists worked to recover DNA from material that had been exposed to the passage of time. The goal was not simply to find any genetic material, but to build a usable profile from the biological traces that remained. The success of that effort created a new investigative path. Genetic genealogy could search for biological relationships connected to the profile. Instead of asking only whether a suspect's DNA was already sitting inside a criminal database, investigators could ask whether relatives of the person who left the DNA might appear somewhere in genealogical records. That was the turning point. The technology did not erase the 60 years between the murder and the investigation. It crossed them. The DNA profile became a bridge between 1966 and 2026, and on the other side of that bridge was a name investigators already knew: Laurel James Switzer. The original suspicion had never completely disappeared. It had simply lacked the scientific evidence necessary to confirm it. Now investigators had something they did not have in 1966. They had a biological connection. They contacted surviving relatives of Switzer. Those relatives voluntarily provided DNA sample. The comparison produced a positive match, confirming that Switzer's DNA was on the cigarettes recovered from the Rudolph crime scene. Suddenly, the cigarette butt became more than a forgotten object. It became a witness that had been silent for 60 years. It placed Switzer at the scene. It gave investigators the connection that had been missing since 1966. It did not resurrect the suspect. It did not create a courtroom confession. It did something different. It allowed modern forensic science to confirm what investigators decades earlier had suspected but could not prove. On March 31st, SIL 2026, the San Rafael Police Department publicly announced that advanced DNA analysis had positively linked Switzer to the homicide. The announcement transformed Marjorie Rudolph's murder from a forgotten cold case into a case with a named suspect and a forensic connection. Yet one mystery remained. What exactly had driven Switzer to the Rudolph home? What was the full nature of the dispute investigators had identified? What happened inside those walls before Rudolph was killed? Because Switzer died only 8 days after the murder, some questions may never be answered. The DNA can tell investigators that his biological material was present. It can establish a connection to the scene. But DNA cannot explain motive. It cannot reveal what someone was thinking. It cannot reconstruct every moment of a crime. It cannot bring the dead back to life. What it can do is break through a wall that has stood for generations. For Marjorie Rudolph's family, that wall had lasted almost 60 years. Her daughter had lived with the absence of a definitive answer. Now, finally, investigators could say that the person they had long considered a suspect was connected to the scene through DNA. The case was not solved through a dramatic confession. It was solved through patience, through preservation, through technology, through investigators who refused to accept that the age of the evidence made it worthless. The cigarette butts had been sitting quietly since 1966. For nearly 6 decades, they appeared to be nothing more than fragments from an old crime scene, but the evidence had never forgotten where it came from. And when science finally learned how to read it, the forgotten killing spoke again. The cigarette but could not speak in 1966. It could not tell detectives who had held it, who had smoked it, or why it had been left inside the home where Marjorie Rudolph was murdered. It could only sit among the other pieces of evidence collected from a crime scene that investigators were desperate to understand. Nearly 60 years later, that same fragment would become the key to a question that had survived generations. Was the man police had suspected in 1966 actually responsible for Rudolph's death? The answer would eventually come through DNA. But to understand why that answer mattered, investigators first had to return to the strange and unfinished story surrounding Rudolph's murder. In the winter of 1966, San Rafael was a very different place from the city known today. The population was small. Technology was primitive by modern standards. There were no mobile phones recording movements, no home security cameras covering neighborhoods, no searchable national DNA databases, and no genetic genealogy companies capable of helping police trace an unknown offender through distant relatives. A murder investigation depended heavily on what detectives could see, what witnesses remembered, what physical evidence could be interpreted, and what suspects could be connected through conventional investigative methods. When Marjorie Rudolph was killed on February 1st, investigators were therefore working within the limits of their era. Rudolph was 60 years old. Her husband was hospitalized, leaving her alone at the residence. At some point, violence entered the house. By the time investigators arrived, Rudolph was dead, having been brutally beaten and found in her bathtub. The scene immediately raised questions about who could have entered the home and why. There was no obvious modern trail of electronic records to reconstruct movements. Investigators had to build a timeline from people, physical evidence, and circumstances. Every detail mattered. A person seen near the house could become important. A conversation could become important. A dispute could become important. A cigarette could become important. And one man quickly became central to the investigation: Laurel James Switzer. Switzer was connected to the Rudolph family, and investigators were aware of a dispute involving him and the Rudolphs. That relationship gave detectives something they desperately needed: a possible motive, and a person who could potentially be connected to the victim. But the existence of suspicion did not mean investigators had solved the murder. They needed evidence capable of establishing that Switzer had actually been inside the home at the time of the killing and that he was responsible for the violence. That distinction would haunt the investigation for decades. The case had a person of interest, but not enough proof. It had physical evidence, but no forensic method capable of turning that evidence into a definitive identity. It had questions, but no courtroom in which those questions could be answered. Then Switzer died. According to the San Rafael Police Department, he traveled to South Lake Tahoe and died by suicide 8 days after Rudolph's murder. His death immediately changed the trajectory of the case. Whatever investigators might have learned from questioning him would never be known. Whatever explanation he might have offered would never be tested. If he had been guilty, he had escaped prosecution by dying before charges could be brought. If he had been innocent, he would never have the opportunity to stand in court and challenge the allegations. The investigation had lost its most important person of interest, and the case eventually went cold. Yet there was something else investigators had lost: time. In 1966, time seemed abundant. A case could remain open for years while detectives continued searching for answers, but time has a way of changing investigations. Witnesses die. Memories become less reliable. Documents disappear. Detectives retire. Evidence can be misplaced or deteriorate. Families age. Entire generations grow up without knowing the details of a crime that once terrified a community. For the Rudolph family, however, the passage of time did not erase the murder. The victim remained dead. The questions remained. The family continued without her. And somewhere inside the San Rafael Police Department's evidence system, pieces of the original investigation remained preserved. Among them were cigarette butts recovered from the scene. Investigators had considered them significant because they appeared to be associated with someone who may not have been a normal occupant of the home. According to later accounts, the cigarettes were a different brand from those generally smoked by the people living there, making them potentially useful clues. In the 1960s, however, investigators had very limited options. A cigarette but could be photographed. It could be packaged. It could be compared with known cigarette brands. It could potentially provide fingerprints if conditions were perfect. But DNA profiling was not yet part of criminal investigation. The concept that a microscopic biological trace could identify a person with extraordinary precision belonged to a future that the detectives of 1966 could not see. The evidence therefore went quiet. The case became an old file. Years passed. Decades passed. The city changed. The police department changed. New generations of detectives encountered the Rudolph name in records rather than in active briefing. And yet, the case never completely disappeared. At some point, retired investigators began looking at old cases again. Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald, both former San Rafael police investigators, became involved in revisiting cold cases as volunteers. Their work eventually brought them back to Rudolph's murder. Instead of accepting that 60 years was too long, they asked a different question. What could modern forensic science do with the evidence that remained? That question was crucial. The original detectives had not failed because they lacked dedication. They had been working with the tools available to them. Modern investigators could now approach the same evidence from a completely different direction. The cigarette, but that had once been little more than an object in a paper evidence bag, could potentially contain enough biological material to create a DNA profile. If scientists could extract that DNA, investigators might be able to compare it against modern databases or use genetic genealogy to identify relatives. The possibility was extraordinary, but there was no guarantee it would work. Evidence from 1966 had been exposed to decades of storage and handling. Biological material can degrade. The amount available may be extremely small. Contamination is always a concern, and even if a DNA profile could be developed, investigators still needed a way to connect that profile to a specific individual. The project therefore required both science and patience. In 2025, the San Rafael Police Department partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and submitted forensic evidence to Othram, a laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. The laboratory's work represented the collision of two eras. The evidence came from 1966. The technology came from the 21st century. The investigators were essentially asking modern science to interrogate a crime seen frozen in time. Othram successfully extracted DNA from the cigarette evidence and used advanced genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. That achievement alone changed the case. For the first time, investigators had genetic information capable of revealing a biological identity. But the profile did not immediately display a name. It created a new kind of question. Who was genetically connected to this unknown person? The answer required genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for the exact individual, investigators could examine biological relationships and construct family connections. A distant relative could become the first thread in a much larger investigation. This was the same conceptual revolution that had transformed other cold cases in recent years. Investigators no longer had to wait for the offender's DNA to appear directly in a criminal database. A relative might provide the path. Once the genealogical investigation produced leads, detectives could return to conventional records and historical information. Names could be examined. Family relationships could be reconstructed. Locations could be compared. Dates could be checked. Suspects could be evaluated against what was already known from the original investigation, and then something extraordinary happened. The modern genetic evidence began pointing back toward the name investigators had considered decades earlier: Laurel James Switzer. The man whose name had appeared in the original investigation was now connected to the DNA profile generated from the cigarette evidence. The significance of that development cannot be overstated. In 1966, investigators had suspicion. In the 21st century, they had biological evidence. The old theory had been transformed into something testable, but investigators still needed to confirm the connection. They could not simply announce that the genealogy pointed to Switzer. A genealogical lead is not the same thing as a forensic identification. The final step required DNA from surviving relatives. Investigators contacted Switzer's family and obtained voluntary DNA samples. Those samples were compared with the DNA profile generated from the cigarette evidence. The result was decisive. The DNA matched. According to the San Rafael Police Department, the genetic evidence positively confirmed that Switzer's DNA was present on the cigarettes recovered from the Rudolph crime scene. The case had changed in a single scientific leap. The suspect, who had died 8 days after the murder, could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not be placed on trial, but his biological identity could still be established. The cigarette butt had accomplished what investigators in 1966 had never been able to do. It had connected a living family line to a piece of evidence from the murder scene. That connection did not answer every question. It did not reveal exactly what happened inside Rudolph's home. It did not establish every detail of the confrontation. It did not explain the precise motive, but it provided something the original case had lacked: scientific confirmation that Switzer's DNA was on evidence from the crime scene, and that confirmation forced investigators to look back at everything they already knew. The old dispute, the original suspicion, the timing, Switzer's death, the physical evidence, the cigarette. Suddenly, pieces that had been scattered across 6 decades began to form a coherent picture. The most striking part was that the breakthrough did not come from discovering a new witness. It came from asking an old piece of evidence a new question. The cigarette had been there since 1966. The science had not. That difference changed everything. When the San Rafael Police Department announced the breakthrough on March 31st, SIL 2026, it formally described the murder as solved through advanced DNA analysis. The announcement closed one chapter, but it also opened a larger discussion about how many other forgotten cases might contain similar opportunity. If a cigarette butt preserved for nearly 60 years could yield a usable DNA profile, what other evidence might still be waiting in police evidence rooms? What old cases had been considered impossible only because the technology of the time could not answer the questions? What fingerprints, biological traces, clothing fibers, photographs, or other physical evidence might suddenly become meaningful under modern forensic analysis? The Rudolph case demonstrated that cold cases are not necessarily dead cases. Sometimes they are simply cases waiting for the right tool. But for the Rudolph family, this was never about technology alone. It was about Marjorie. It was about a woman who had been killed inside her own home and whose family had spent nearly 60 years without definitive answers. The passage of time had not changed the fact that she deserved to be remembered. It had only made the question harder to answer. Now the answer had arrived from an object so small that it could have been overlooked entirely. A cigarette, butt, a discarded fragment, a piece of trash that became evidence, evidence that became DNA, DNA that became a family tree. a family tree that returned investigators to a suspect from 1966. And suddenly, the forgotten killing was no longer forgotten. The silence had been broken. The past had been forced back into the present, and the first question was no longer who could have killed Marjorie Rudolph. The question had become something far more chilling. What else had the original investigation missed that modern science might still be able to reveal? The morning after Marjorie Rudolph was killed, San Rafael was confronted with a crime scene that seemed almost impossible to understand. A woman had been murdered inside her own home, yet the house did not immediately provide investigators with the kind of clear explanation they needed. There was no obvious stranger caught fleeing the neighborhood. No modern surveillance footage existed. No electronic trail could reconstruct the hours surrounding the killing. And the person who would eventually become the central suspect was not an unknown outsider, but someone connected to the Rudolph family. The case began with a question that would survive for 60 years. Who had entered Marjorie Rudolph's home that evening, and why? On February 1st, still 1966, Rudolph was alone. Her husband, Leroy Rudolph, a prominent banker, was hospitalized at the time. According to later reporting, a neighbor had spoken with Marjorie that afternoon and invited her to dinner, but she declined, saying she was already in her robe and intended to stay home. Investigators later believe the fatal attack occurred sometime that evening after that conversation and before the discovery of her body the following morning. The scene was violent. Rudolph had suffered severe injuries to her head and chest, and her body was found in the bathtub. Retired San Rafael detective Harry Barbier later described the attack as extraordinarily brutal, saying she had been struck with an unknown object, suffered extensive head injuries and broken rib, and was dragged down the hallway before being placed in a bathtub filled with water. The details immediately suggested that this was not an ordinary burglary gone wrong. Investigators found evidence that appeared to suggest an attempt to make the scene look like a robbery, but according to later accounts, nothing of significant value had actually been taken. There were also no obvious signs of forced entry. That raised an unsettling possibility. If the killer had not smashed a window or forced open a door, how had the person entered? Did Marjorie know the visitor? Had she willingly opened the door? Was the violence the result of a confrontation that began only after the killer was inside? Those questions became critical because the answer could narrow the suspect pool dramatically. A stranger breaking into a home leaves one kind of investigative trail. Someone who is welcomed inside leaves another. The distinction mattered even more because of the cigarette evidence. Investigators recovered 3 Salem cigarette butts from the crime scene. They believed the cigarettes could have belonged to the person responsible for the killing because they did not fit the smoking habits investigators associated with the Rudolph household. In 1966, however, those cigarettes could not provide what they eventually would. Detectives could preserve them. They could document them. They could speculate about who had smoked them. But they could not extract a modern DNA profile and compare it against relatives of a suspect who had been dead for decades. The technology simply did not exist. The evidence was therefore trapped in time. It could tell investigators that someone had been smoking inside the house. It could not tell them exactly who. Then investigators began looking closely at Laurel James Switzer. Switzer was already connected to the Rudolph family. His wife worked for Leroy Rudolph at the Bank of America branch in San Rafael, and the two families knew one another. Investigators also learned that there had been some kind of dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family before the murder. The San Rafael Police Department later described that dispute as something that might have led to the homicide. Although the exact nature of the disagreement was never established, this was the first major threat: a person who knew the family, a possible conflict, a potential reason for anger. And then the timeline became even more troubling. When detectives went to speak with Switzer, they learned from his wife that he had left home at around 6 p.m. on the evening Marjorie Rudolph was killed. She had not heard from him afterward. The timing did not prove anything by itself. A person leaving home during the evening is not evidence of murder. But in a homicide investigation, timing can transform an ordinary event into something investigators cannot ignore. Switzer had a connection to the victim. There was a reported dispute. He was apparently away during the critical period, and the crime scene contained cigarette butts that investigators believed could have belonged to him. Yet the case still lacked the evidence necessary to establish what had happened beyond reasonable doubt. Then came the development that would freeze the investigation in place. Switzer left the Bay Area for South Lake Tahoe. 8 days after Rudolph's murder, he died by suicide. In one moment, investigators lost the possibility of confronting their suspect directly. There would be no interrogation years later. No courtroom, no plea, no opportunity to ask him about the cigarettes, no chance to challenge his explanation for where he had been that night. If investigators believed Switzer was responsible, they now had to live with the fact that the suspect was dead. And if they were wrong, they had lost the chance to prove it. The case became a historical mystery almost overnight. The public knew a woman had been brutally killed. Investigators knew they had a person of interest, but the legal system could not turn suspicion into prosecution because there was no living defendant. The evidence remained. The question remained. The years began to accumulate. 6 decades later, the timeline of the original investigation would become one of the most important aspects of the cold case. When retired investigators Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald revisited the case, they were not beginning from nothing. They were inheriting the work of detectives who had investigated the murder in 1966. They had the original evidence. They had the old case files. They had the name of the original suspect. They had the cigarettes. What they did not have was the technology that could connect those pieces with scientific certainty. In 2025, they partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and submitted forensic evidence from the case to Othram, a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. The decision was deceptively simple: test the old evidence again. But behind that decision was a fundamental change in forensic science. In 1966, investigators could preserve a cigarette butt without knowing that the biological material on it might someday identify the person who smoked it. In the modern era, scientists can sometimes recover genetic information from extremely limited or degraded material. Othram successfully extracted DNA from the evidence and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. This was the moment when the case began moving at a speed it had not experienced in generations. The investigators now had a genetic profile, but a profile without a name is still a mystery. The next challenge was to determine who might be biologically connected to it. Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team conducted a genealogy search and generated investigative leads. Those leads were passed back to Barbier and McDougald. The detectives then had to do something that was both modern and traditional. They had to follow the genetic information, but they also had to follow the old case. The family name that emerged from the genealogy investigation mattered because it intersected with a person already present in the original 1966 investigation, Switzer. That coincidence was extraordinary. For 60 years, investigators had been unable to prove what they suspected. Now, a new scientific method was independently leading them toward the same individual. But detectives still needed confirmation. A genealogical lead could suggest a family connection. It could not by itself establish that a specific deceased person had left biological material at the crime scene. So investigators contacted Switzer's surviving relatives. The relatives consented to providing DNA reference samples. Scientists compared those samples with the genetic profile developed from the cigarette evidence. The result was a positive match. The cigarettes had finally spoken. Their biological evidence connected Switzer to the scene. After nearly 60 years, the original suspicion had acquired scientific support, but even that breakthrough had to be described carefully. The San Rafael Police Department said the DNA confirmed Switzer was present at the crime scene and identified him as the likely suspect. Because he had died 8 days after the murder, investigators could not prosecute him or establish every detail of what happened through a trial. Police acknowledged that the exact circumstances of his involvement and his true motivation may never be known. That distinction is important. The evidence answers one question with extraordinary power. Switzer's DNA was on the cigarettes recovered from the murder scene. It places him there. But the evidence does not narrate the entire crime. DNA cannot tell investigators exactly what was said inside the house. It cannot reveal the emotional trigger behind the attack. It cannot reconstruct every movement. It cannot explain why the confrontation became lethal. It cannot provide a confession from a man who died in 1966. Those questions may remain permanently beyond reach. And yet, for Marjorie Rudolph's family, the new evidence represented something they had not possessed for almost 6 decades. A scientifically supported identification of the person investigators believe was responsible. The investigation had moved from suspicion to evidence. That transformation changed the historical meaning of the case. For years, Switzer's name could only be discussed as that of a suspect. Now, police could publicly say that advanced DNA analysis had positively linked him to the crime scene. The San Rafael Police Department announced the breakthrough on March 31st, SIL 2026. The announcement did not come with an arrest. There was no suspect being led away in handcuffs. There was no courtroom packed with reporters waiting for a verdict. The suspect had been dead for nearly 60 years. Instead, the arresting image was the evidence itself. Cigarettes preserved from a 1966 murder, finally producing a genetic answer in the 21st century. That was the strange power of this cold case. The killer, whoever he was, had disappeared into history. The evidence had not. The original detectives could not use DNA. The retired investigators could. The original suspect could not be questioned. His surviving relatives could provide the biological reference material. The original crime scene could not be revisited as it looked in 1966. The preserved evidence could. And suddenly, the distance between the murder and the present collapsed. A cigarette smoked in 1966 had become a forensic message in 2026. The message pointed to Laurel James Switzer, and once that happened, investigators were forced to look back at the old timeline with a completely different understanding. The man they had suspected from the beginning had not simply been a name in an old file. His DNA had been sitting inside the evidence all along. The case had not been missing a clue. It had been missing the technology capable of reading the clue. That realization may be the most unsettling part of the entire investigation. For decades, the answer had been physically present. It was not buried. It was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was preserved, waiting. And while the people involved in the original investigation grew older and eventually disappeared from public memory, the evidence remained in the dark, carrying information nobody in 1966 knew how to extract. Then modern science arrived, and the past suddenly became readable. The question that had haunted the Rudolph family for generations was no longer simply who might have been responsible. Investigators now had a name. Laurel James Switzer, a man who had been suspected in 1966, a man who died 8 days later, a man whose DNA was ultimately found on cigarettes recovered from the scene, and a man whose exact motive may now be one of the few remaining mysteries that 60 years of silence will never surrender. The name Laurel James Switzer had existed in the Rudolph case for decades, but a name in an old police file is not the same thing as a proven connection to a murder. That distinction had defined the investigation from the beginning. Detectives in 1966 had reasons to look at Switzer. They knew he had a connection to the Rudolph family. They knew there had been some kind of dispute. They knew he had left the Bay Area shortly after the killing, and they knew he died by suicide only 8 days after Marjorie Rudolph was murdered. But suspicion could not reconstruct the crime. It could not place Switzer inside the house with scientific certainty. It could not explain exactly what happened between the moment Marjorie opened her door and the moment her body was discovered in the bathtub. And it could not answer the question that would eventually become decisive. Was the cigarette evidence connected to Switzer? For 60 years, that question remained suspended between possibility and proof. The modern investigation changed that. But before the DNA could speak, investigators had to understand the old case all over again, because cold case work is rarely about discovering a completely new story. It is about returning to an old story and asking whether the evidence can now be interpreted differently. The San Rafael Police Department's original case number, Senior 66 99683, belonged to a murder committed in an era when forensic science was still decades away from the revolution that DNA would eventually bring. The crime scene had been documented. Evidence had been collected. A suspect had emerged, but the case had never crossed the final threshold into certainty. Marjorie Rudolph had been found dead inside her San Rafael home on February 1st, Sill, 1966. She was 60 years old. Her husband, a prominent banker, was hospitalized, leaving her alone at the residence. Police later concluded that someone had entered the home and brutally attacked her. Contemporary reporting and later investigations described severe injuries and a body found in the bathtub. The circumstances immediately created a disturbing question about the killer's relationship to the house. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, and later accounts indicated investigators believed Marjorie may have allowed the person inside. That possibility was crucial because it suggested the killer may not have been a random stranger. The person at the door may have been someone she recognized, someone she trusted enough to let inside, someone who knew where she lived, someone who knew that her husband was not there. Those details could never be treated as absolute proof of identity, but they gave investigators a framework for understanding the crime. And then there were the cigarettes. 3 cigarette butts were recovered at the scene. Investigators believe they could be significant because the cigarettes were associated with someone other than the Rudolph household. Today, the significance is obvious. A person smokes a cigarette, saliva remains on the filter, biological material survives, DNA can sometimes be extracted, a genetic profile can potentially be created. But in 1966, none of that was available. The cigarette was simply a cigarette. It might indicate that a visitor had been there. It might provide a clue about the habits of a person investigators were searching for, but it could not identify that person. The evidence had information inside it, but nobody yet possessed the scientific language necessary to read it. That limitation would become one of the most important facts in the entire case. The original detectives were not staring at empty evidence. They were staring at evidence that belonged to the future. Their problem was not necessarily that the clue did not exist. Their problem was that the technology needed to interpret it had not yet arrived. As investigators worked through the case, Switzer's name became increasingly important. Police knew he was acquainted with Marjorie and her husband. They also believed a dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family might have provided a motive. The San Rafael Police Department later described that dispute as a possible factor in the homicide. Although the exact details of the disagreement were not fully established, the investigation therefore contained several elements that pointed in the same general direction, but none of them alone was conclusive. A relationship was not proof. A dispute was not proof. Being absent from home during the critical period was not proof. And a cigarette found inside the house could not be scientifically tied to a suspect. The case needed a bridge connecting those fragments. That bridge did not exist. Then Switzer left the area. According to police, he went to South Lake Tahoe and died by suicide 8 days after Rudolph's murder. His death transformed the investigation from a case that might eventually produce an arrest into a case whose most important suspect could never be prosecuted. Whatever information Switzer possessed disappeared with him. Investigators could not ask him where he had been. They could not ask him whether he had visited the Rudolph home. They could not ask him about the cigarettes. They could not confront him with the evidence. They could not test his explanation against a jury's judgment. The unanswered questions simply remained, and as the years passed, those questions became harder to resolve. The people who knew Marjorie grew older. Detectives who had worked the case retired. Some witnesses eventually died. The physical landscape changed. The memories surrounding the case became increasingly distant, yet the evidence remained inside police custody. That was the one advantage time had not taken away. The cigarette butts were still potentially capable of carrying biological information. The question was whether modern science could recover it. Decades later, retired San Rafael detectives Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald became involved in the effort to revisit the case. They were not simply looking for a dramatic story. They were looking at an old homicide that had never received a definitive answer. Their work as volunteer cold case investigators reflected a broader reality of unsolved homicide investigations. Sometimes cases survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. The detectives went back through the evidence and eventually partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. In 2025, forensic evidence from the Rudolph investigation was sent to Othram, a Texas-based laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis, the decision represented a remarkable collision of time period. Evidence collected when Marjorie Rudolph was alive was now being examined with technology that would have been unimaginable to the detectives who first entered the scene. Othram successfully extracted DNA from the cigarette evidence and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. That was the moment the investigation changed from historical reconstruction to modern forensic analysis. But even a complete DNA profile does not automatically provide a name. Investigators needed to determine who might be genetically connected to the person represented by that profile. Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team conducted a genealogy search and generated investigative leads. Those leads were sent to Barbier and McDougal. The detectives then did what cold case investigators have always had to do. They followed the evidence. Names were examined. Family relationships were reconstructed. Historical information was compared with what was already known about the 1966 investigation, and eventually, the genealogy leads pointed toward the Switzer family. That was the moment when the past suddenly became relevant again. The name that had existed inside the original case was now appearing through a completely different scientific route. It was no longer merely a detective's old suspicion. Modern genetic analysis was pointing investigators toward the same family connected to the man who had been considered a suspect in 1966. But investigators still had to prove the connection. A genealogy lead could be wrong. A relative could share genetic characteristics without being the person who left the evidence. The investigation therefore required another step. Detectives contacted surviving relatives of Switzer and asked them to voluntarily provide DNA reference samples. They agreed. Scientists then compared the relatives' genetic information with the profile developed from the cigarettes recovered at the Rudolph crime scene. The result was a positive match. Police said the comparison confirmed that Switzer's DNA was on the cigarettes for the first time. The old suspicion had a scientific foundation. The man who had been investigated in 1966 was now genetically connected to evidence recovered from the murder scene. The cigarette butts had become a biological link between Switzer and the house. And because Switzer had died only days after the homicide, that evidence carried an extraordinary historical weight. It could not lead to an arrest. It could not produce a confession. But it could answer a question that had remained unresolved for generations. Was Switzer present at the scene? The DNA evidence indicated that he was. The San Rafael Police Department announced on March 31st, SIL 2026, that advanced DNA analysis had positively linked Switzer to the homicide. The announcement was extraordinary precisely because of what it did not contain. There was no suspect to photograph, no courtroom appearance, no police interview, no dramatic arrest. The man investigators believed responsible had been dead since 1966. The arrest had happened 6 decades too late. The evidence had finally caught up with the suspect, but the suspect was already beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. That created an unusual kind of resolution. Police could identify and connect the suspect to the scene, but they could never prosecute him. They could explain why his name had appeared in the original investigation. They could confirm that his DNA was present on the cigarettes. They could establish a powerful connection between Switzer and the crime scene. But they could not recreate every second of that night. They could not ask him what happened. They could not establish his exact motive through testimony. And they could not give Marjorie's family the one thing a trial might have provided, a complete narrative spoken by the person accused. Instead, the evidence had to speak for itself. The cigarettes could establish presence. The DNA could establish identity. The historical records could establish relationships. The original investigation could establish suspicion. Together, those pieces formed the strongest explanation available after 6 decades. Yet there was still an uncomfortable gap between identification and complete understanding. Why did Switzer go to the Rudolph home? What was the dispute with the family? What happened after Marjorie opened the door? Was the apparent robbery staging deliberate? Why were the cigarettes left behind? Did Switzer smoke them before the violence, during a confrontation? Or at another point during his time inside the house? Those questions remain part of the mystery because DNA cannot answer them. Genetic evidence can tell investigators who contributed biological material. It cannot tell a story in human language. It cannot reveal intention. It cannot provide emotion. It cannot reconstruct motive. That is why the Rudolph case remains haunting even after the suspect was identified. The central mystery has been dramatically narrowed, but some darkness remains. And perhaps that is unavoidable when a murder is almost 60 years old. The man who could have answered the remaining questions chose another path. 8 days after Marjorie's death, Switzer died by suicide. The investigation therefore reached a strange ending decades after the suspect himself had already disappeared. The final witness was not a person. It was a cigarette. The final breakthrough was not a confession. It was DNA, and the final connection was not made by the detectives of 1966, but by investigators working in a world of genome sequencing and forensic genetic genealogy. The case had crossed generations without losing its most important clue. That realization gives the Rudolph investigation its most chilling quality. For almost 60 years, the evidence had been waiting in silence. The people involved could not make it speak. The technology could not yet read it. But the biological information was there. It had been there from the beginning. The cigarette had carried the answer through every year the case remained unsolved. It carried the answer through the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and into the 2020s. And when investigators finally developed the technology to recover that answer, it pointed backward to a name already written inside the original case file. Laurel James Switzer. The man who had once been only a suspect had become the man modern DNA linked to the scene. The forgotten evidence had become the strongest voice the investigation had left. And after 60 years of silence, that voice was impossible to ignore. The most unsettling part of the Marjorie Rudolph case was not that investigators had finally identified a man nearly 60 years after the killing. It was that the answer had been sitting inside the evidence for almost the entire time. The cigarette butts had never moved. The biological material on them had survived. What changed was the ability to read it. In 1966, investigators could only look at the cigarettes as physical objects. In 2025, scientists could treat them as genetic evidence. That difference transformed a forgotten clue into a forensic connection, and suddenly the old investigation began to look different. The man at the center of the original suspicion, Laurel James Switzer, was no longer simply a name in a decades-old file. His DNA had been recovered from cigarettes collected at the scene, and investigators had independently reached his family through forensic genetic genealogy. The San Rafael Police Department announced the breakthrough on March 31st, SIL 2026, saying the advanced testing had positively linked Switzer to the homicide. But the deeper story was how investigators reached that conclusion, because the path was not a straight line from cigarette to name. It was a chain of decisions, each one depending on the previous one, each separated by years of uncertainty. First came preservation, then came renewed interest, then advanced DNA extraction, then genome sequencing, then genealogy, then traditional detective work, then voluntary DNA samples from surviving relatives, and finally, the match. Break one link, and the case might still be sitting in an evidence room today. The original detectives could not have imagined that possibility when they collected the cigarettes in 1966. They were dealing with a brutal homicide, not a future genetic investigation. Their priority was to understand what had happened to Marjorie Rudolph and who might have been responsible. They knew Rudolph was 60 years old. They knew she had been home alone. They knew her husband was hospitalized. They knew the attack had been violent. And they knew there were clues suggesting the killer may have been someone who could enter the residence without immediately raising suspicion. According to the San Rafael Police Department, Switzer knew the Rudolph family and had been considered a suspect during the original investigation. Police also said investigators believed a dispute between Switzer and the family might have contributed to the homicide. That information made him important, but it did not make him guilty. Investigators needed evidence. They needed something capable of moving the case beyond suspicion. The cigarette butts were potentially that evidence, but science had not yet reached the point where they could deliver an identity. The case therefore entered a strange period in which investigators had a theory but no definitive proof. Then Switzer disappeared from the investigation in the most final way possible. Police said he left the Bay Area for South Lake Tahoe and died by suicide just days after the killing. His death meant that even if investigators continued to suspect him, there would be no opportunity to interrogate him, arrest him, or place him before a jury. Whatever he knew about February 1st, SIL 1966, would remain locked inside the mind of a dead man. The investigation could not move forward through a confession. It had to depend on physical evidence, and that made the cigarettes even more important. They were not merely remnants from the scene, they were potentially the only surviving objects capable of carrying a direct biological connection to the person who had been there. Decades later, that possibility became the reason the case could be reopened. Retired San Rafael investigators Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald continued working cold cases as volunteers. Their involvement was not simply a nostalgic return to an old file. It was an attempt to determine whether evidence that could not be fully exploited in 1966 could be analyzed with modern technology. In 2025, they partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and submitted forensic evidence from the Rudolph investigation to Uthram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory. That decision placed the case in the hands of scientists whose tools would have seemed almost impossible to the detectives of the 1960s. Uthram successfully extracted DNA from the cigarette evidence and used genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile. The old cigarette had become a genetic sample. But now the investigators faced a different problem. A DNA profile is powerful, but without a known comparison, it can remain anonymous. The investigators needed to determine whose DNA it was. That was where forensic genetic genealogy changed the investigation. Instead of waiting for the unknown profile to match a criminal database, the laboratory could search for genetic relationships. Distant relatives could become clues. A family connection could become a branch. A branch could become a tree. And somewhere in that tree could be the person investigators were seeking. Uthram's forensic genetic genealogy team conducted the search and generated investigative leads. Those leads were then passed to Barbier and McDougald. At that point, the investigation moved from laboratory science back into detective work. Genetics could identify relationships, but detectives had to determine what those relationships meant in the context of a murder that had occurred 60 years earlier. They had to compare names against the original case. They had to examine family history. They had to consider ages, locations, relationships, and the circumstances of the 1966 investigation. And gradually, the genetic trail pointed toward the Switzer family. That was an extraordinary development. The modern scientific investigation was arriving at the same name that had already existed in the original police investigation. But investigators still needed to be careful. Genetic genealogy can generate leads, but a genealogical lead is not automatically proof that a particular individual contributed the DNA. The final identification required a direct comparison. That is why the next step mattered so much. Investigators contacted surviving relatives of Switzer. Those relatives voluntarily provided DNA samples. Scientists compared those samples against the profile recovered from the cigarette evidence. The result was a positive match. Police said the comparison confirmed that Switzer's DNA was on the cigarettes found at the crime scene. In practical terms, the evidence had finally done what it could not do in 1966. It connected a biological trace to a specific person. The cigarette had crossed the gap between suspicion and scientific identification, and because the person had already been identified as a suspect during the original investigation, the result was especially striking. Modern technology had not simply produced an unexpected name from nowhere. It had strengthened a theory that investigators had been unable to prove 6 decades earlier. That did not mean every detail of the original theory was automatically confirmed. DNA on a cigarette establishes that Switzer smoked it or otherwise left his biological material on it. But it does not by itself explain every action inside the home. It does not tell investigators precisely when the cigarette was smoked. It does not establish the complete sequence of events. It does not reveal motive. Those limitations are important. especially in a case where the suspect is deceased and cannot respond to the evidence. The DNA could tell investigators something extraordinarily important, but it could not tell them everything. That distinction became central to understanding the final resolution. Police could identify Switzer as the person whose DNA was found on the cigarettes. They could connect him to the scene. They could point to the original investigation, which had already considered him a suspect. But they could not conduct a modern interrogation. They could not put the DNA result before Switzer and ask for his explanation. They could not present the evidence to a jury. They could not hear his version of the events. The man who might have answered the remaining questions had been dead since 1966. His suicide, occurring only 8 days after Rudolph's murder, according to police, had created a permanent barrier between the investigation and the person at its center. That is why the case's resolution feels different from a conventional cold case arrest. There was no dramatic knock on a door, no police officers waiting outside a suspect's workplace, no handcuffs, no booking photograph. The suspect was already gone. Instead, the breakthrough came through an object that had been silent for generations. The San Rafael Police Department's announcement effectively gave the public a scientific answer where the original investigation had been unable to provide one. The case had a suspect who was now positively linked to the physical evidence. The old file had been transformed. But for the Rudolph family, the most important part was not the technology. It was Marjorie. She had been 60 years old when she was killed. Her husband was in the hospital. She had been home alone. A normal evening had become a homicide investigation. The family then had to live with decades of uncertainty. They had to carry the memory of a murder without a definitive answer. They had to hear theories, remember the original investigation, and watch time move further and further away from the crime. Every passing decade made the case seem less likely to be solved. Yet the family did not have the luxury of simply forgetting. The victim remained part of their history. That is why the statement from the San Rafael Police Department about cold cases never growing cold in the hearts of victims' families carries such weight. A police file can be placed in storage. A detective can retire. A suspect can die. Evidence can become decades old. But the absence left by a murder does not age in the same way. The family continues to know exactly what was lost. The breakthrough, therefore, represented more than an interesting forensic development. It was a long-delayed acknowledgement that the investigation had not been forgotten. Someone had continued to ask whether the evidence could still speak, and eventually it did. The cigarette butts became the unlikely witnesses. They could not describe the killer's face. They could not tell investigators what he said. They could not explain what happened in the final minutes of Marjorie's life, but they could provide something more precise than memory. Biological identity. That identity led to Switzer, and Switzer led back to the original investigation. Suddenly, the details that had once seemed disconnected gained new significance. The family relationship, the reported dispute, the timing, his departure from the area, his death shortly afterward, the cigarettes. None of those facts alone could solve the case. Together, viewed through the lens of modern DNA evidence, they created a much clearer picture of the investigation's central suspect. Yet the case still contained one final mystery that science could not erase. What happened inside the house that night? The answer may never be known completely. The only person capable of giving a first-hand account is gone. The physical evidence can establish a connection, but it cannot recreate consciousness. It cannot tell investigators what Switzer thought when he entered the house. It cannot reveal what Marjorie said. It cannot explain what turned the encounter into murder. It cannot tell the family why she was targeted. Those unanswered questions remain part of the tragedy. Still, there is an important difference between an unanswered mystery and an unanswered identity. For nearly 60 years, investigators did not know with scientific certainty who had left the biological evidence behind. Now they did. That is a profound change. The case no longer exists in the same state of uncertainty as it did in 1966. Modern forensic science has rewritten the final chapter, and the most remarkable part is that it did so without finding a new crime scene, a new eyewitness, or a new confession. It did so by returning to something investigators had collected at the beginning. The cigarette butt had waited. The evidence had waited. The family had waited. The technology eventually caught up, and when it did, the man whose name had remained buried in the old investigation emerged once again into the light. Laurel James Switzer. 60 years after Marjorie Rudolph's murder, his DNA had finally provided the connection investigators had lacked. The case was no longer simply a forgotten killing from 1966. It had become a demonstration of what happens when old evidence meets new science. The past had not vanished. It had been preserved, and sometimes the most frightening thing about a cold case is realizing that the truth may have been sitting there all along, waiting for someone to know how to read it. The breakthrough in the Marjorie Rudolph case was powerful because it did not come from a spectacular new discovery. Nothing was dug out of the ground. No forgotten witness suddenly appeared. No anonymous letter arrived at police headquarters. Instead, investigators went back to something that had been preserved since the beginning and asked whether modern science could finally extract the information hidden inside it. That decision transformed the meaning of the entire investigation. For decades, the Rudolph case had been a story of suspicion without final proof. Laurel James Switzer had been considered a suspect in 1966, but the investigation had never reached a courtroom. He died only 8 days after Rudolph's murder, leaving investigators without the possibility of an interrogation or trial. The case eventually became cold, but when retired San Rafael detectives Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald returned to it decades later, they discovered that time had not erased everything. The physical evidence was still there. Among the preserved items were cigarette butts recovered from the scene. Those cigarettes would become the bridge between a murder in 1966 and forensic science in the 21st century. The San Rafael Police Department later said, the evidence was submitted to a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis in 2025. Scientists successfully extracted DNA and used genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive profile. That profile created an opportunity that the original investigators could never have imagined. Instead of asking only whether Switzer could somehow be connected to the murder through traditional evidence, investigators could now ask whether the DNA recovered from the cigarettes belonged to his biological family. The answer would eventually point back to him. But before that happened, the investigators had to navigate a process in which every step mattered. A DNA profile can be extraordinarily powerful, but an unidentified profile is still just that, unidentified. Investigators needed a path from genetic information to an actual person. Forensic genetic genealogy provided that path. The technique uses genetic relationships to identify possible family connections and generate investigative leads. It does not magically announce a suspect's name. Instead, it creates a network of biological relationships that investigators must interpret carefully. In the Rudolph case, Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team searched for connections associated with the unknown DNA profile and produced investigative leads. Those leads were returned to Barbier and McDougald, who then combined the genetic information with traditional detective work. The old case file suddenly mattered again. Every name, every relationship, every historical detail, every known connection between the Rudolph family and the people who surrounded them in 1966. The investigators were not starting from an empty page. They were comparing a modern genetic trail against a 60-year-old investigation, and then the name Laurel James Switzer returned to the center. That was perhaps the most remarkable moment of the entire process. The man who had been suspected in the original investigation was now appearing through a completely different scientific route. 6 decades earlier, detectives had arrived at his name through conventional police work. 6 decades later, genetic genealogy independently pointed toward his family. The two investigations were converging. One had begun with interviews, relationships, circumstances, and suspicion. The other began with DNA. They were separated by almost 60 years, yet they were moving toward the same individual. But investigators could not simply declare the mystery solved. The genetic genealogy lead had to be confirmed. Surviving relatives of Switzer were contacted and voluntarily provided DNA samples. Scientists compared those samples with the profile developed from the cigarettes recovered at the Rudolph crime scene. The comparison produced a positive match. Police said Switzer's DNA was confirmed on the cigarettes. That result gave investigators something the original case had never possessed: a direct biological connection between Switzer and physical evidence. From the scene, it was the missing link. The old suspicion had become scientifically supported, yet that did not mean the DNA could answer every question. This is where the Rudolph case becomes more complicated than the dramatic headline might suggest. DNA can identify a biological contributor. It can place a person in contact with an object. It can establish a connection between a suspect and evidence. But DNA does not tell investigators exactly what happened. It does not describe a confrontation. It does not explain motive. It does not reveal a person's thoughts. It cannot tell a jury what a suspect intended at a particular moment. And in this case, the person whose DNA was identified had been dead for almost 60 years. There was no opportunity to confront him with the evidence. There was no possibility of asking whether he had been inside the house. There was no chance to hear his explanation for the cigarette. There would be no trial in which prosecutors could reconstruct the night through testimony and cross-examination. The investigation, therefore, had to end differently. It ended through the combination of historical evidence and modern forensic science. The cigarettes established the biological connection. The original investigation established why Switzer had already been considered a suspect. His relationship with the Rudolph family provided context. Investigators had previously learned that there had been a dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family, and police later described that dispute as a possible motive for the killing. His movements after the crime were also part of the historical investigation. According to police, he left the Bay Area and went to South Lake Tahoe. 8 days after Rudolph's murder, he died by suicide. Those facts had existed for decades, but they could never be placed alongside a definitive DNA connection. Now they could, and suddenly the old timeline looked different. A man known to the family, a possible dispute, a critical evening, cigarette evidence at the scene, departure from the area, death 8 days later. Then, nearly 60 years afterward, DNA from the cigarettes connected to his family. The evidence did not erase the uncertainties, but it changed their nature. The question was no longer simply who might have been responsible. Investigators had a scientifically supported suspect. The remaining uncertainty concerned the details and motive of the crime. That distinction is crucial because cold cases often contain layers of unanswered questions. Solving one layer does not automatically solve all the others. In Rudolph's case, the greatest breakthrough was the identification of the person linked to the biological evidence. The precise sequence of events may never be fully reconstructed, and that is partly because time has removed the people who could have explained it. Marjorie cannot describe her final hour. The original investigators cannot revisit every decision they made. Witness memories have disappeared. Switzer cannot defend himself or confess. The case has become a historical crime reconstructed through surviving evidence. That makes the cigarette even more significant. It is one of the few physical remnants capable of connecting the present investigation to the night of the murder. The object is small, almost insignificant. A discarded cigarette, but would normally be something people throw away without a second thought. But in a homicide investigation, small objects can become enormous. The cigarette had been touched. It had been smoked. Biological material remained on it, and because investigators preserved it, the information survived. The case therefore demonstrates an important principle in forensic investigation. Evidence does not need to be understood immediately to become valuable later. In 1966, the cigarette was preserved because it might matter. In 2026, it mattered more than anyone could have imagined. Modern DNA technology had effectively reached backward through time. It allowed investigators to take an object collected during the original investigation and use it to answer a question that had remained open for generations. That is why the Rudolph case became more than an individual homicide investigation. It became a demonstration of how cold cases can change when old evidence is examined with new technology. The same evidence can produce completely different investigative possibilities depending on what science is capable of doing. A fingerprint once considered too faint may become analyzable. A photograph may be digitally enhanced. A damaged document may be reconstructed. Biological material that once appeared useless may contain a complete genetic profile. The evidence does not necessarily change. The technology does. In Rudolph's case, The cigarette did not suddenly become important in 2026. It had always been important. Investigators simply gained the ability to understand why. For Marjorie's family, the significance was deeply personal. 60 years is long enough for a crime to become history to the outside world. It is long enough for newspapers to stop mentioning the victim. It is long enough for new generations to grow up without knowing her name. But for the people who loved her, the murder remained personal. The unanswered question never truly became old. The San Rafael Police Department emphasized that cold cases do not grow cold in the hearts of victims' families, a sentiment that captures the emotional reality behind the forensic breakthrough. The family did not receive Marjorie back. No DNA test can reverse a murder. No laboratory can erase grief. But the investigation could finally provide something that had been absent for generations, an evidence-based answer about the person connected to the crime scene. That answer matters because uncertainty has its own kind of cruelty. A family may spend decades wondering whether the killer will ever be identified. They may wonder whether investigators missed something. They may wonder whether the truth is still somewhere inside an old evidence box. In this case, it was. The truth was not completely lost. It was preserved in biological material attached to a cigarette. And eventually, investigators found a way to read it. On March 31st, SIL 2026, San Rafael Police publicly announced the identification, bringing national attention to a murder that had remained unresolved since 1966. The announcement was unusual because there was no living suspect to arrest. The resolution arrived through evidence rather than handcuffs. There was no dramatic police operation. There was no suspect walking into a courtroom. There was simply a name that had once been buried inside a 60-year-old investigation and a DNA profile that now connected that name to evidence from the crime scene. Laurel James Switzer, the original suspect, the man who died shortly after the murder, the person whose biological material remained behind. His death meant that justice could never take the form it might have taken in 1966, but identification still mattered. It changed the historical record. It gave investigators a scientifically supported conclusion. It allowed Marjorie Rudolph's murder to be remembered not merely as an unsolved killing, but as a case in which modern forensic science finally established a connection that had eluded investigators for generations. And yet, the case still refuses to surrender every secret. What exactly happened between Marjorie and Switzer? What triggered the violence? Why was she attacked so brutally? What was the precise purpose of the apparent robbery staging? Why were the cigarettes left behind? Did Switzer believe he had removed every trace of himself? Did he ever imagine that something as ordinary as a cigarette could survive him? These questions may never have answers. The man who could have provided them is gone. But one question has changed forever. Who was connected to the evidence? Now investigators know. The cigarette answered that question after almost 60 years. The object that once looked insignificant became the strongest surviving biological witness to a forgotten crime. It carried a message from 1966 into the future, and when the future finally learned how to read it, the message was unmistakable. The man investigators had suspected decades earlier had left his DNA behind. The case had not been defeated by time. Time had only delayed the moment when the evidence could speak. The revelation that Laurel James Switzer's DNA was found on the cigarettes recovered from the Rudolph crime scene did not simply close a file. It forced investigators to look backward, to examine the original case through the lens of evidence that had not been scientifically readable in 1966. For decades, the murder had existed in a strange state of suspension. There had been a victim. There had been a brutal crime scene. There had been a suspect. There had been questions about motive and opportunity, but there had never been the definitive forensic connection necessary to transform suspicion into certainty. Then, almost 60 years later, a laboratory produced the missing link. The San Rafael Police Department announced on March 31st, SIL 2026, that advanced DNA analysis had positively linked Switzer to the homicide. The breakthrough came after retired investigators Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald revisited the case and worked with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office to submit evidence for modern testing. sexrpd.org. But behind that announcement was a much more complicated question. What did the new evidence actually tell investigators about the night Marjorie Rudolph died? The answer was powerful, but limited. DNA could establish a biological connection. It could not reconstruct the entire crime. That distinction became essential as investigators attempted to separate what they now knew from what they might never know. The cigarette evidence established that Switzer had left biological material on cigarettes recovered from the crime scene. According to police, surviving relatives voluntarily provided DNA samples, and the resulting comparison produced a positive match. CRPD.org. That was an extraordinary development because Switzer had already been a suspect in the original investigation. The modern evidence was therefore not pointing toward an entirely unexpected individual. It was strengthening a suspicion that had existed since 1966, yet the passage of time had created a problem that DNA alone could never solve. The central suspect was dead. Police said Switzer had left the Bay Area for South Lake Tahoe and died by suicide 8 days after Rudolph's murder. SRPD.org. His death meant there would be no second investigation in the traditional sense. Detectives could not confront him. Prosecutors could not question him under oath. A defense attorney could not challenge the evidence on his behalf. A jury could not weigh his testimony against the forensic evidence. The case had reached the modern era without the person at its center, and that created an eerie imbalance. Science could now speak more clearly than it ever had before, but the person who might have answered the remaining questions was silent forever. To understand why that mattered, investigators had to return to Marjorie's final known hour. On February 1st, Sill 1966, she was at home in San Rafael. Her husband, Leroy Rudolph, was hospitalized. According to later account, Marjorie had spoken with a neighbor earlier in the day and declined an invitation to dinner because she was already preparing to stay home. SFGate.com. It was the kind of ordinary decision that becomes haunting only afterward. There was no way for her to know that remaining at home would place her alone at the center of a murder investigation. By the following morning, she was dead. Her body was found in the bathtub, and investigators documented severe injury. Later descriptions of the crime scene emphasized the brutality of the attack. Retired Detective Harry Barbier described extensive head injuries and broken ribs while saying Rudolph had been dragged down a hallway before being placed in the bath. ABC7news.com. Every physical detail created another question. Why such violence? Why the bathtub? Why was she moved? Why were cigarettes left behind? Why had the killer apparently been able to enter the residence without the kind of forced entry investigators might expect from a stranger? These questions became increasingly important when investigators considered Switzer's relationship with the Rudolph family. Switzer was not an unknown figure from outside the community. His wife worked for Leroy Rudolph at the Bank of America branch in San Rafael, and the families knew each other. Police later said investigators had identified a dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family and believed it could have played a role in the killing. CSRPD.org. That connection did not establish guilt by itself, but in a cold case, context matters because evidence rarely exists in isolation. The DNA was one piece. The relationship was another. The original suspicion was another. Switzer's disappearance and death shortly afterward were another. None alone could explain the murder. Together, they created a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. The cigarettes became particularly significant because they were tangible remnants from the crime scene. Free Salem cigarette butts were recovered, and investigators believe they could have been left by the killer. ABC7news.com. 4 decades, however, those cigarettes were essentially trapped in the past. Investigators could preserve them, photograph them, catalog them, and store them, but they could not obtain the kind of DNA profile that modern laboratories can sometimes develop. This is one of the strangest elements of forensic history. A clue can exist long before anyone knows what it is worth. The evidence may appear ordinary. Its importance may remain invisible until science catches up. That was exactly what happened here. In 2025, Othram received forensic evidence from the case. Scientists extracted DNA and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive profile. SRPD.org. The technology did not travel backward through time. The evidence did. The cigarette from 1966 was still there, carrying biological information deposited by a person who had been dead for decades. Scientists were finally able to interpret that information. The next step was forensic genetic genealogy. Othrum's genealogy team generated investigative leads from the DNA profile, and those leads were returned to the retired detective. SRPD.org. This was where the investigation became almost cinematic in its symmetry. In 1966, detectives had started with people, relationships, and circumstances and eventually focused on Switzer. In the modern investigation, scientists started with anonymous DNA and moved through biological relationships until the same family name emerged. Two completely different investigative paths were converging on the same destination, but investigators still needed direct confirmation. Surviving relatives provided DNA reference samples voluntarily. The samples were compared with a profile recovered from the cigarettes. The match was positive. Switzer's DNA was confirmed on the evidence. SRPD.org. At that point, the case changed forever. The question was no longer whether modern science could connect the cigarette to Switzer. It had. The question became what that connection meant within the larger story of the murder. The most defensible conclusion was that Switzer had been present at the crime scene and had smoked the cigarettes. Police identified him as the likely suspect responsible for the homicide. But investigators also acknowledged that because Switzer had died shortly after the murder, the exact circumstances and motivation might never be fully known. SaysRPD.org. That limitation mattered. Headlines can make a cold case breakthrough sound absolute, as if every mystery disappears the instant DNA produces a name. Reality is different. DNA can be extraordinarily precise about biological identity, but it does not automatically explain conduct. The cigarette tells investigators who contributed the biological material. It does not tell them why that person was in the home. It does not reveal the argument, if there was one. It does not describe the violence. It does not establish every movement made during the attack. It does not explain what happened immediately before or after the killing. Those questions remain dependent on historical evidence and inference. And in the Rudolph case, the most important witness who could have answered them is unavailable. Switzer's suicide 8 days after the murder closed that door permanently. His death also created another layer of mystery. Why did he leave the Bay Area? Why did he go to South Lake Tahoe? What was happening in his life during those 8 days? Was his departure connected to the killing? Did he understand that investigators were focusing on him? Or was his death unrelated to the investigation? The historical record can establish the sequence of events, but it cannot provide a definitive psychological explanation. That is where the case reaches the boundary between evidence and speculation. Investigators can state what they know. They can describe what the DNA established. They can document Switzer's connection to the victim and the original investigation, but they cannot responsibly invent the missing pieces. The unanswered questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. The modern breakthrough was enormous, but it did not erase the darkness surrounding the final hours of Marjorie's life. It simply illuminated one part of it. For the first time, investigators could look at the old evidence and say that the biological material belonged to the man who had been considered a suspect in 1966. That gave the family something they had been denied for generations, a scientifically supported identification. Yet it also revealed how much remained unknowable. The victim could not speak. The suspect could not speak. The witnesses who remembered the era were aging or gone. The house itself could not testify. The only surviving witness capable of offering new information was microscopic. It was inside a cigarette filter. That cigarette had been thrown away in a moment nobody thought would matter. It became the silent witness that survived every person connected to the case. 6 decades passed. The world changed. Forensic science changed. San Rafael changed. But the evidence remained. And then, one day, investigators opened the door to the past again. The result was not an arrest. It was not a confession. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more haunting. Confirmation. The man who had once been only a suspect was now scientifically linked to the crime scene. His name was no longer supported solely by the suspicions of detectives working in 1966. It was supported by DNA recovered from physical evidence. The old investigation had found the shadow. Modern science finally revealed the biological signature behind it. And as investigators announced the breakthrough in 2026, the story of Marjorie Rudolph's murder moved from an unresolved chapter of San Rafael history into the strange category of cold cases that are solved without a living perpetrator ever facing justice. The killer, according to investigators, had not escaped because the evidence disappeared. He had escaped because time intervened. He died before science could catch up, but the cigarette remained. The DNA remained, and eventually, those two things were enough to break 60 years of silence. The identification of Laurel James Switzer did not erase the mystery surrounding Marjorie Rudolph's final night. Instead, it sharpened it. For nearly 60 years, investigators had been forced to live with an incomplete picture. Now they had a scientific connection between Switzer and evidence recovered from the crime scene, but they still had to confront the questions that DNA could not answer. The cigarette could identify the person who left biological material behind. It could not describe the violence. It could not reveal the conversation that preceded it. It could not explain what happened inside the Rudolph home after the door was closed. And it could not tell investigators what Switzer was thinking when he left the house and disappeared from the Bay Area. That silence became even more striking because the original investigation had already placed Switzer near the center of the case. According to the San Rafael Police Department, Switzer knew the Rudolph family, and investigators had identified a dispute between him and the family that they believed could have been connected to the killing. Says rpd.org. In another case, such a connection might have led to an interrogation, a search warrant, surveillance, or an eventual arrest. But the Rudolph investigation unfolded in 1966, and the timeline moved brutally fast. Switzer left the area and went to South Lake Tahoe. 8 days after Marjorie's death, he died by suicide. sysrpd.org. Whatever investigators wanted to ask him, they would never have the opportunity. His death turned the investigation into something unusually difficult. A homicide with a suspected perpetrator who could never be placed before a court. The case therefore depended almost entirely on what could be preserved, and what survived was more important than anyone could have known. The cigarettes remained in evidence. For decades they were essentially frozen pieces of the original crime scene. Investigators of the 1960s had no way of knowing that saliva on a cigarette filter could eventually become a source of a comprehensive DNA profile. They could only preserve what they believed might be useful. That simple act became crucial. When retired, San Rafael detectives Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald revisited the case decades later. They did not need to recreate the evidence. They needed to ask whether technology had finally advanced far enough to extract information from it. In 2025, forensic evidence from the Rudolph investigation was submitted to Othram, a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis. Scientists successfully extracted DNA from the cigarette evidence and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive profile. srpd.org. The development represented an extraordinary reversal of the original investigation. In 1966, detectives had a physical object but no genetic identity. In 2025, investigators had the genetic identity but needed to determine whose it was. The evidence had not changed. The question had, and forensic genetic genealogy provided a way to pursue the answer. Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team searched for biological relationships connected to the unknown profile and generated investigative leads. Those leads were then returned to Barbier and McDougald, who compared them with the historical information already contained in the case. srpd.org. The result was remarkable. The genetic investigation pointed toward the Switzer family. Once again, the name that had appeared in the original investigation was emerging from the evidence, but this time it was arriving through a completely different route. 6 decades earlier, detectives had focused on Switzer because of his relationship to the Rudolph family and circumstances surrounding the crime. 6 decades later, scientists were tracing an unidentified DNA profile through family relationships and arriving at the same family. The two investigations had begun in different centuries of forensic science, yet they were converging on the same individual. That convergence was important, but investigators still needed confirmation. Surviving relatives of Switzer voluntarily provided DNA reference samples. Scientists compared those samples with the profile developed from the cigarette evidence. The comparison produced a positive match. According to police, SRPD.org, the cigarette had finally acquired a name, Laurel James Switzer. But that name created another question. What could investigators responsibly say about his role? The answer had to remain grounded in what the evidence actually established. The DNA linked Switzer to the cigarettes found at the crime scene. Police identified him as the likely suspect in Rudolph's killing, yet the evidence did not provide a complete reconstruction of the homicide. This distinction is particularly important because the case involves a dead suspect and no possibility of a criminal trial. There would be no opportunity for prosecutors to present the complete theory of the crime in court. There would be no defense challenging the evidence. There would be no jury weighing competing interpretations. The modern investigation, therefore, had to stop where the surviving evidence stopped. That boundary did not make the breakthrough meaningless. Quite the opposite. It made the breakthrough historically significant because it solved a question that had remained open for almost 60 years without pretending that science could answer questions beyond its reach. The cigarette could say, in effect, this biological material came from Switzer. It could not say, this is exactly what happened next. That second story remained buried with the people who were there. Marjorie's final hours therefore remained partly obscured. Investigators knew she had been home alone. Her husband was hospitalized. She was later found dead in the bathtub after suffering severe injury. Later accounts described a brutal assault involving head injuries and broken ribs. ABC7news.com. Those facts created the framework, but not the complete narrative. Somewhere between Marjorie's ordinary evening and the discovery of her body, the circumstances changed catastrophically. And somewhere inside that period, the cigarettes were smoked. That small detail became one of the few pieces of physical evidence capable of carrying a biological identity from the past into the present. It is difficult to overstate how strange that is. A cigarette is designed to disappear. It burns away. It is discarded. Its existence is temporary. Yet one of these cigarettes survived for nearly 60 years in evidence. The smoker disappeared. The investigation grew cold. The technology changed. The cigarette remained. It became a time capsule containing biological information that could not be understood when it was collected. The same object that had once seemed like a minor clue eventually became central to the resolution of the case. And that is why the Rudolph investigation offers such a powerful lesson about cold cases. Sometimes the most important evidence is not the evidence that produces an immediate breakthrough. Sometimes it is the evidence that investigators preserve without knowing exactly how it will be used. The detectives of 1966 could not have foreseen forensic genetic genealogy. They could not have imagined genome sequencing being applied to a cigarette. They could not have known that surviving relatives might one day provide reference DNA that would connect an old suspect to old evidence. They simply preserved the physical traces available to them. Decades later, a new generation of investigators could build upon that foundation. But technology alone was not enough. Someone had to return to the case. Someone had to believe that the evidence was worth testing. Someone had to take an old box of evidence and ask whether the science had changed enough to make a difference. That persistence came from Barbier and McDougald, who worked on the case as retired investigators. Their involvement demonstrates another reality of cold case investigations. Cases can survive because people continue to care about them long after the original investigation has ended. A police department may have thousands of reports. Detectives retire. Priorities change. New crimes demand attention. Yet occasionally an old case finds its way back into the hands of someone willing to look again. The Rudolph investigation was one of those cases. The new investigation did not replace the old one. It built on it. The original detectives had identified Switzer as a suspect. The modern investigators found a way to test that suspicion with technology that had not existed when Rudolph was killed. The result was a convergence between historical police work and modern forensic science. That convergence also changed the emotional meaning of the case. Before the DNA result, Marjorie's family had a question without a definitive answer. After the DNA result, they had a scientifically supported identification of the man investigators believed responsible, but they still did not have every answer. They could know who had left the biological evidence behind. They could know that the original suspect was now linked to the crime scene. Yet they could not know exactly why the violence happened. The passage of time had taken too much away. The people who might have explained the motive were gone. The memories that could have filled the gaps had faded. The house where the crime occurred had become part of history. The suspect himself had been dead since 1966. The investigation therefore reached an ending that was simultaneously definitive and incomplete. It was definitive in one narrow but crucial sense. Investigators could identify the person whose DNA was found on the cigarettes. It was incomplete because the full circumstances surrounding Marjorie's death could never be reconstructed with absolute certainty. That tension is what makes the case so haunting. A cold case can be solved without every mystery disappearing. Sometimes solving the case means answering the most important question while accepting that some smaller questions will remain forever beyond reach. In the Rudolph investigation, the central breakthrough came from an object that had been almost invisible for decades. 3 cigarette butts had remained behind. One contained biological material capable of being analyzed with modern technology. That material produced a genetic profile. Genetic genealogy produced investigative leads. Surviving relatives provided reference samples. The comparison produced a match. And suddenly, the investigation had traveled from an anonymous cigarette to a specific name, Laurel James Switzer. The name had been part of the case since 1966, but now it carried a completely different weight. It was no longer simply the name of a suspect recorded by detectives working with limited forensic tools. It was the name associated with DNA recovered from the crime scene. The San Rafael Police Department publicly announced the breakthrough on March 31st, SIL 2026, srpd.org. The announcement effectively ended one of the longest periods of uncertainty surrounding the Rudolph homicide. Yet there was still something unsettling about the timing. The breakthrough arrived after almost 60 years, but Switzer had been dead for almost the entire period during which investigators were searching for definitive proof. Justice, in the conventional sense, could not follow the evidence to a courtroom. There would be no arrest. There would be no sentencing. There would be no moment when a judge pronounced a punishment. The resolution would have to exist in another form: identification, documentation, and historical truth. For the family, that might be the closest thing the case could provide. The unanswered question had not vanished. It had changed. For decades, the question had been, who killed Marjorie Rudolph? After the DNA breakthrough, the more difficult questions became, why? And exactly what happened? Those questions are different. The first could be approached through forensic genetics. The others may never be answered. And as investigators closed the modern chapter of the case, the cigarette evidence remained a symbol of everything that had happened. It had been there in 1966. It had remained through every decade of silence. It had survived the suspect. It had survived the original detectives. It had survived the fading memories of witnesses. And eventually, it provided the biological information that modern science could finally decode. A tiny object became a witness to history. It could not speak about the murder itself, but it could speak about who had been there. After 60 years, that was enough to change the story forever. The case had now crossed a line that investigators in 1966 could never have imagined. Laurel James Switzer was no longer simply a name preserved in an old homicide file. His DNA had been recovered from cigarette evidence found at the scene, and surviving relatives had provided reference samples that produced a positive comparison. San Rafael police said the result placed Switzer at the scene and identified him as the likely suspect in Marjorie Rudolph's killing. But one question remained suspended above everything else. If investigators had suspected Switzer almost from the beginning, Why had the truth remained buried for nearly 60 years? The answer was partly technological, partly historical, and partly tragic. In 1966, DNA testing did not exist. Investigators could collect evidence, preserve it, photograph it, question witnesses, establish timelines, and follow people connected to the victim, but they could not take a cigarette butt and extract a genetic identity from it. That limitation gave time an enormous advantage. Switzer was already dead. Memories faded. Investigators retired. The physical crime scene became history, but the cigarettes remained. 3 Salem cigarette butts had been recovered during the original investigation, and investigators believed they belonged to the person they suspected. For decades, those objects were essentially silent. Then science learned how to make them speak. That transformation is what gives the Rudolph case its extraordinary power. The cigarette did not suddenly appear in 2025. It had been there since 1966. The answer had not suddenly been created. It had been preserved. What changed was the ability to interpret it. When retired, San Rafael detectives Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald revisited the case. They partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and submitted forensic evidence to UFRO, a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. In 2025, scientists successfully extracted DNA from the evidence and developed a comprehensive genetic profile using genome sequencing. The investigators now had something the original detectives never possessed, a biological signature. But a signature without a name is still a mystery. The laboratory therefore used forensic genetic genealogy to generate investigative leads. Those leads were returned to Barbier and McDougald, who compared the genetic information with the historical case. The process eventually brought the investigation back to the Switzer family. It was a remarkable convergence. The detectives of 1966 had looked at the people surrounding Marjorie Rudolph and identified Switzer as a possible suspect. The investigators of the 21st century started with anonymous DNA and followed biological relationships until they reached the same family. 2 investigations, separated by 6 decades, had arrived at the same name by completely different routes. But the most important step was still ahead. Investigators contacted Switzer's surviving relative. With their consent, they obtained DNA reference samples. Scientists compared those samples with the profile recovered from the cigarette evidence. The comparison produced a positive match. Police said the result confirmed that Switzer's DNA was present on the cigarettes and placed him at the crime scene. Suddenly, an old suspicion had a modern scientific foundation. Yet the discovery did not provide investigators with the luxury of asking Switzer what happened. He had been dead since 1966. Police said he died by suicide 8 days after the murder. That detail changed everything about the way the case could be resolved. In an ordinary investigation, the discovery of DNA connecting a suspect to a homicide might trigger an arrest, an interrogation, a search for additional evidence, and eventually a prosecution. None of those steps was possible here. The man at the center of the investigation was beyond reach. There would be no interrogation room. No detective could place the cigarette evidence in front of him and ask why his DNA was there. No prosecutor could question him under oath. No defense attorney could challenge the evidence. No jury could hear both sides. The evidence had arrived too late for that. The case could be solved historically, but justice could not take the traditional form. And that distinction matters because the word solved can mean different things. For the San Rafael Police Department, the case was resolved because modern DNA analysis established Switzer's presence at the scene and strengthened the conclusion that he was the likely suspect. But police also acknowledged that his exact involvement and true motivation may never be known. That remaining uncertainty is not a weakness in the investigation. It is a boundary created by history. Science can identify biological material. It cannot resurrect a witness. It cannot reconstruct a conversation that nobody recorded. It cannot force a dead suspect to explain his action. It cannot determine with absolute certainty what was happening inside a person's mind nearly 60 years earlier. The evidence tells investigators something extraordinarily important. It does not tell them everything. That distinction becomes even more powerful when the circumstances of Marjorie's death are considered. She was 60 years old. She was home alone in San Rafael while her husband was hospitalized. Someone entered the residence, and she was violently attacked. Later accounts describe devastating head injuries, broken ribs, and her body being dragged into a bathtub filled with water. The violence suggested that something had gone terribly wrong inside a place that should have been safe. Yet the reason remained unclear. Police said Switzer knew Marjorie and her husband, and case files indicated there had been some kind of dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family that investigators believed may have been connected to the homicide. But the nature of that dispute has never been fully established in the public record. That leaves an unsettling gap. Investigators now have a strong biological link, but they do not have a complete explanation for the motive. The cigarette tells them Switzer was there. It does not tell them why. It does not explain the argument. It does not reveal whether Marjorie recognized him when he arrived. It does not establish exactly when the cigarettes were smoked, and it cannot reconstruct the sequence of violence that followed. Those missing details matter because the final moments of a victim's life are often the part families most desperately want to understand. Who came through the door? What did Marjorie say? What did the killer want? Was there an argument? Did she realize she was in danger? Was the attack planned, spontaneous, or triggered by something that investigators never discovered? These questions may remain forever beyond reach, and yet there is something powerful about finally knowing the identity of the man who had been connected to the case from its earliest days. For decades, Switzer's name existed in the shadow of suspicion. Now, modern forensic analysis had transformed that shadow into a documented genetic connection. The original investigators had not been able to prove their theory. The modern investigators could. That is why the cigarette evidence became so important. It represented continuity between two generations of police work. The first generation collected it. The second generation understood what it could become. Without preservation, there would have been nothing to test. Without the decision to reopen the case, the evidence might have remained untouched. Without advanced DNA technology, the profile might never have been developed. Without genetic genealogy, the profile might have remained anonymous. Without surviving relatives willing to provide reference samples, the investigative trail might have stopped. Every step depended on another, and every step pushed the case closer to the same conclusion. The story therefore became less about one dramatic breakthrough and more about persistence. Cold cases rarely surrender their secrets in a single moment. They move through years of waiting. Evidence sits in storage. Investigators change careers. Families grow older. New technologies appear. And sometimes, decades later, someone asks one more question. Could this old evidence still tell us something? In the Rudolph case, the answer was yes. The evidence could still speak. It had simply been waiting for the right scientific language. That realization also changes how the original investigators should be viewed. It is easy, decades later, to look at an unsolved case and assume someone failed. But the technology available in 1966 placed strict limits on what detectives could establish. They could suspect Switzer. They could investigate his relationship with the Rudolphs. They could examine the cigarettes. But they could not extract the genetic information that modern investigators recovered. The case was not necessarily abandoned because there were no clues. It remained unresolved because the clues could not yet be converted into proof. The difference is enormous. The original detectives were working without one of the most powerful forensic tools available today. The evidence they collected was essentially a message written in a language that had not yet been invented. 6 decades later, scientists could finally translate it, and the translation pointed back to the same man. That is why the announcement in March 2026 carried such weight. San Rafael police had not discovered a completely unknown killer. They had finally confirmed the presence of a previously identified suspect. The case had come full circle. The investigation began with Switzer as a possible suspect. It remained unresolved after his death. Decades passed. Then modern DNA analysis returned to the cigarettes and independently connected the evidence to his family. The circle closed. But closure is not the same as completeness. The family could receive an answer about who investigators believed was responsible, but they could not receive every answer about why Marjorie was killed. The motive remained uncertain. The exact circumstances remained uncertain, and because Switzer died only 8 days afterward, those uncertainties may never be resolved. That is perhaps the cruelest element of the case. The man investigators believe was responsible disappeared before the evidence could catch him. He left behind only fragments, a name, a history, a connection to the Rudolph family, a suspected dispute, a few cigarettes, and eventually DNA. The cigarettes became the strongest surviving witnesses, but even they had limits. They could say, with scientific force, that Switzer's biological material was present. They could not describe the murder. They could not testify about intention. They could not tell the family what happened in the final minutes of Marjorie's life. The evidence could identify. It could not explain. And so the case moved into an unusual form of resolution. It was no longer an unanswered identity mystery. It was a historical homicide in which investigators had identified the likely suspect through modern forensic evidence, while accepting that some questions would remain permanently unanswered. For Marjorie's family, that distinction may have mattered more than any headline. The world had spent decades knowing her only as the victim of an old, brutal murder. Now the investigation could finally attach a scientifically supported name to the person believed responsible. 60 years had passed, but the evidence had not forgotten. The cigarette had not forgotten. The laboratory had not forgotten. And the investigators who returned to the case refused to forget. Their persistence turned a forgotten object into a modern forensic witness. It transformed an old suspicion into a genetic connection, and it proved something that cold case investigators have learned again and again. Time can bury a crime, but it does not necessarily erase the evidence. Sometimes the smallest object survives the longest. Sometimes the clue everyone overlooked becomes the clue nobody can ignore. And sometimes the truth is not gone at all. It is simply waiting inside an evidence box, waiting for someone to know how to read it. In Marjorie Rudolph's case, that truth had been waiting since 1966. It waited while the suspect lived. It waited after he died. It waited through decades of silence. And finally, almost 60 years later, it spoke through DNA. The announcement that Marjorie Rudolph's murder had finally been solved did not arrive with the kind of dramatic ending usually associated with a major homicide investigation. There was no suspect waiting behind a locked door. No police convoy, no courtroom, no confession. The man investigators identified had been dead for nearly 60 years. Instead, the final breakthrough came quietly, through laboratory analysis of evidence that had been collected when the world was a very different place. Yet the quiet nature of the discovery made it no less extraordinary. A cigarette but recovered from a 1966 crime scene had survived long enough for modern forensic science to extract DNA from it, and that DNA ultimately pointed investigators back to Laurel James Switzer, the man who had already been considered a suspect during the original investigation. CSRPD.org. For the investigators who returned to the case, the breakthrough represented the closing of a circle that had remained open for generations. For the Rudolph family, it represented something even more profound, the end of one kind of uncertainty. For decades, Marjorie's death had remained attached to a question mark. Now there was a scientifically supported name, but there was also a painful realization. Identifying the likely killer could not restore the missing years. It could not erase the violence of February 1st, Sill 1966. It could not reconstruct every moment of Marjorie's final hour, and it could not answer every question left behind by a crime whose central suspect had taken his own life only days afterward. That was the strange final stage of the investigation. The evidence had become stronger, but the story itself remained incomplete. The original crime had taken place inside Marjorie's San Rafael home while her husband, Leroy Rudolph, was hospitalized. She had been alone. According to later accounts, she had declined an invitation to dinner earlier that day, saying she intended to remain home. Essavegate.com. What followed transformed an ordinary evening into a murder investigation. Marjorie was found dead the next morning. Her injuries were severe, and later descriptions of the crime scene portrayed an attack of extraordinary violence. Retired Detective Harry Barbier said she had suffered major head injuries and broken ribs and had been dragged before her body was placed in a bathtub. ABC7news.com. Investigators immediately faced a difficult puzzle. There was a dead woman. There was evidence inside the house. There were indications that the person responsible may have known the victim, and there was a possible connection to Switzer. But the investigation could not produce the kind of definitive proof that would survive the demands of a criminal trial. The cigarettes were among the clues investigators preserved. 3 Salem cigarette butts were recovered from the scene, and investigators believe they could have been left by the person responsible. ABC, 7news.com. At the time, however, the biological information on those filters was effectively invisible. There was no way to extract a modern DNA profile. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no database capable of searching distant biological relationships. The cigarettes could be preserved, but their deepest information remained inaccessible. That limitation became critical when Switzer died. Police later said he had left the Bay Area for South Lake Tahoe and died by suicide 8 days after Rudolph S. murder. SaysRPD.org. His death effectively froze the investigation. A person who might have provided answers was suddenly unreachable. If investigators had questions about his movements, his relationship with Marjorie, or the reported dispute between him and the Rudolph family, they could no longer ask him directly. Whatever explanation existed inside his mind disappeared with him. The case could only be solved through evidence that survived, and for decades, that evidence seemed incapable of producing the final answer. Then the calendar reached 2025. Retired San Rafael detectives Harry Barbier and Kevin McDougald revisited the case and partnered with the Sacramento County District Attorney's office. They submitted forensic evidence to Othram, a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis. SRPD.org. The decision represented a fundamental change in the investigation. Instead of asking whether the original detectives had missed a witness or overlooked a document, the investigators asked whether the physical evidence itself could now be examined in a completely new way. The answer was yes. Othram successfully extracted DNA from the cigarette evidence and developed a comprehensive profile through forensic-grade genome sequencing. SRPD.org. The old evidence had suddenly become modern forensic material, but the profile did not arrive with a name attached. Investigators still had to determine whose DNA it represented. That was where forensic genetic genealogy became decisive. Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team searched for biological relationships and generated investigative leads. Those leads were then returned to the retired detectives, who compared them against the historical information from the original case. SafeRPD.org. The genetic trail began pointing toward the Switzer family. It was an astonishing convergence. The original investigation had pointed toward Laurel James Switzer through conventional police work. The modern investigation had begun with an unidentified DNA profile and arrived independently at the same family. Yet investigators still needed a direct comparison before they could make a definitive identification. Surviving relatives of Switzer voluntarily provided DNA reference samples. Scientists compared those samples with the genetic profile developed from the cigarette evidence. The result was a positive match. According to police, Switzer's DNA was confirmed on the cigarettes recovered from the crime scene. SRPD.org. That result transformed the old case. The evidence had finally connected Switzer to the scene through biology. It was no longer merely a historical theory. It was no longer only an investigator's suspicion. It was a forensic connection created from physical evidence preserved since the original investigation. And yet, precisely because the evidence was so powerful, investigators also had to be precise about what it did and did not establish. The DNA showed that Switzer's biological material was on the cigarettes. It placed him at the crime scene. Police identified him as the likely suspect in Rudolph's killing, but the DNA could not describe the entire sequence of events. It could not prove exactly when the cigarettes were smoked. It could not reveal what Switzer said or thought. It could not explain the argument or establish the complete motive. It could not tell investigators whether the violence was planned or erupted from a confrontation. Those questions belonged to the missing human story, and that story had disappeared with the people who lived through it. The reported dispute between Switzer and the Rudolph family remained part of the historical context. Police said investigators believed that dispute might have played a role in the homicide, but the precise nature of the dispute has not been fully established publicly. SRPD.org. That uncertainty matters because motive is one of the most difficult elements to recover in a case this old. Investigators can analyze DNA. They can examine documents. They can compare historical records. But they cannot manufacture a conversation that was never recorded. They cannot reconstruct thoughts. They cannot question a dead suspect. The Rudolph case therefore demonstrates an uncomfortable truth about cold cases. Sometimes science can identify a person without being able to explain the entire crime. The distinction is easy to lose in sensational headlines. 60-year-old murder solved sounds like every mystery has been answered. In reality, one enormous question has been answered while others remain. Who was connected to the crime scene? Modern DNA provides the answer. Why did the killing happen? That remains less certain. What exactly happened inside the home? Some evidence exists, but a complete reconstruction may never be possible. What did Switzer know about the crime afterward? His death prevents investigators from ever hearing his answer. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is what Marjorie experienced in the final moments of her life. No laboratory can recover that. No genealogy database can reconstruct it. No modern technology can return her voice. The breakthrough, therefore, carried both relief and sadness. It provided a name, but not a complete explanation. It offered scientific certainty where there had once been suspicion, but it could not erase the tragedy that created the case. Still, the identification mattered. It changed how the murder would be remembered. For decades, Marjorie Rudolph had been the victim of a killing whose perpetrator was never definitively identified. Now investigators could say that advanced DNA analysis had linked Switzer to evidence from the scene. The San Rafael Police Department publicly announced the breakthrough on March 31st, SIL 2026, SRPD.org. The timing was extraordinary. Nearly 60 years had passed since the original homicide. A generation had become several generations. The people who knew Marjorie in life had aged. The detectives who first investigated her